I remember everything about that night. The way the wind howled through the trees, the scent of damp wood and decaying leaves, the heavy weight in my gut that told me something wasn't right. I came to this cabin in the woods for solitude, to clear my head after months of stress and burnout. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but instead, it turned into the longest night of my life. I arrived in the late afternoon. The drive had been long, mostly winding roads through dense forest, the kind of place where you don't see another car for miles. I rented the cabin from an older man I found online. It was small, nothing fancy. A single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a front porch with a creaky wooden swing. No Wi-Fi, no TV, just the sound of nature all around me. That was the point. I wanted to be alone, disconnected from everything. By the time I unloaded my bags and settled in, the sun was dipping below the treetops. I made myself a quick dinner, just a can of soup and some crackers, and then sat outside on the porch, listening to the forest. It was peaceful at first. The rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant chirp of crickets. Then I noticed something odd. The forest had gone silent. I didn't realize it at first, but when I did, it sent a chill down my spine. No crickets, no owls, no rustling of branches. Just complete, suffocating silence. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a shift in the wind or an animal passing through. But something about it felt wrong. I sat there, listening, my ears straining for any sound. After a few minutes, the normal noises returned, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I shook it off and went inside. I locked the door behind me, more out of habit than fear, and checked my phone. No service, of course. That was expected, but it still made me feel uneasy. I turned on the small lamp by the couch and pulled out a book, trying to distract myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That strange silence, the way it crept in so suddenly, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Around 10, I decided to call it a night. I checked the locks again, front door, back door, all secure. The cabin had only a few small windows, and they were all shut tight. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled deep in my bones. I lay in bed, listening. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches outside. The occasional creak of the cabin settling made my pulse jump, but I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. Then I heard it, a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer moving through the underbrush. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. Someone was out there. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, footsteps moving just beyond the tree line. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, gripping it tight, my heart hammering in my chest. Part of me wanted to believe it was just a camper or a lost hiker, but I knew better. People don't walk that quietly in the woods unless they're trying not to be heard. I sat up slowly, my eyes locked on the window. The curtains were thin, barely covering the glass. I didn't want to move, didn't want to risk making any noise. But then the footsteps stopped, right outside the cabin. I barely breathed, every muscle in my body tensed. I wanted to look, to peek through the curtain and see what was out there, but fear kept me frozen. Minutes passed, nothing, just the wind and my own racing heartbeat. Then, a soft tap on the window. I nearly dropped the flashlight. It wasn't a knock, not exactly, just the lightest touch, like someone running their fingers along the glass. My mind went into overdrive. Was it an animal? No, an animal wouldn't do that. It was a person. Someone was out there, standing right by my window, touching the glass. I forced myself to move, slowly climbing out of bed. I kept the flashlight off, not wanting to give away my position. My phone was useless out here, no service, no way to call for help. I needed to stay calm, to think. Another tap. This time it was on the front door. I nearly stopped breathing. I knew, without a doubt, that whoever was out there wasn't lost. They weren't here by accident. They were testing me, seeing if I would react. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped. Silence. Then, footsteps again. Slow, steady, circling the cabin. My stomach twisted into knots. I thought about making a run for my car, but my keys were in the kitchen, and the front door was too close to whoever was outside. I didn't want to risk it. Instead, I moved as quietly as I could toward the kitchen, grabbing the biggest knife I could find. My hands were shaking. The footsteps stopped, right outside the back door this time. I gripped the knife tighter, my body pressed against the wall. The door had a flimsy lock, nothing that would hold if someone really wanted to get in. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and fast. Then, finally, after what felt like hours, the footsteps retreated. Slowly at first, then fading into the distance. I waited, heart pounding, listening for any sign that they might come back. Minutes passed, then an hour, then two. I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen, the knife clutched in my hand, staring at the door. The wind howled outside, but no more footsteps, no more tapping. When the sun finally started to rise, I dared to move, inching toward the window and peering outside. Nothing, just the empty forest. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and got the hell out of there. I didn't even stop to check the outside of the cabin. I just drove, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, until I saw other cars, other people. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding all night. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that cabin again. I drove up the winding mountain road in silence, the only sound the crunch of gravel under my tires. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from the main highway, tucked away in a place where cell service was non-existent. I had rented it for the week, just me, my truck, and the quiet. Work had been running me into the ground, and I needed time away from emails, phone calls, and people in general. The listing had made the place look perfect. A small one-bedroom log cabin with a wood-burning stove, a stocked kitchen, and a front porch that overlooked a stretch of untouched forest. No neighbors, no noise, just complete solitude. That's exactly what I had wanted. I pulled up in front of it just as the sun started dipping below the trees. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but it looked sturdy, with thick wooden beams and a sloped roof covered in pine needles. The windows were dark, the door locked with an old-fashioned key I had picked up from a small rental office about an hour back. Stepping out of my truck, I stretched my legs. The air smelled like damp earth and pine. No traffic noise, no voices, just the occasional rustling of branches in the breeze. It was peaceful. I grabbed my bag from the truck bed and made my way up the wooden steps. The door creaked as I unlocked it and pushed it open. The inside was as simple as I expected. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a single armchair, and a small kitchen tucked into the corner. A narrow hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. The first thing I did was check the fridge. The rental agreement said it was stocked with the basics, and they hadn't lied. There were eggs, milk, a loaf of bread, and some butter. More than enough for the week. I locked the door behind me, unpacked my bag, and set my things in the bedroom. The bed was a queen size with a heavy quilt draped over it. A small nightstand sat beside it, and next to that was the only window in the room, looking out into the trees. That first night, I lit a fire in the stove, made a sandwich, and sat in the armchair with a book. It was so quiet, not just the kind of quiet you get in a small town, but the deep, unsettling kind of quiet where you start to hear things. The creak of the walls, the shifting of the floorboards as the cabin settled. The kind of quiet that makes you second-guess whether you're alone. I shook it off and went to bed early. The mattress was firm but comfortable, and the heavy quilt made the bed feel safe and warm. I fell asleep faster than I expected. Then I woke up. First, I thought it was nothing, just that strange feeling of waking up in a new place and not knowing why. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I realized what had woken me. The front door. It had made a noise. Not a loud bang or anything dramatic, just a faint click, the kind you hear when a door shifts slightly in its frame. I stayed still, listening. Maybe it was the wind, but the air had been still when I arrived, not even a breeze. I got up, moving slowly, and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. When I stepped into the living room, the fire had burned down to embers, casting flickering shadows along the walls. The front door was still closed. I checked the lock. It was still turned. Maybe I had imagined it. I double-checked the windows, making sure they were latched, and went back to bed. The next morning, I shook off the uneasy feeling and told myself I was just adjusting to the silence. I spent most of the day hiking, following a narrow trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. Felt good to be out there, away from everything. By the time I got back, the sun was low again. I made dinner, read a little, and tried to ignore how quickly the unease settled back in as night fell. That second night, I woke up again. This time, there was no mistaking the noise. It wasn't just the door shifting, it was footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate, just outside the cabin. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped. I lay there, straining to hear anything else. The wind? An animal? But it hadn't sounded like that. It had sounded like boots on dirt, the careful steps of someone trying not to be heard. I reached for my flashlight again, but I didn't get up right away. Instead, I waited. Nothing. I finally forced myself out of bed and checked the front window. The porch was empty. The trees stood still in the moonlight. I turned on the porch light, but it only lit a small circle of ground, leaving the woods beyond in darkness. I didn't sleep much after that. The third night, I was ready. I kept my flashlight and a hunting knife beside me in bed. And when I woke up, I knew I hadn't imagined it. The footsteps were back, closer this time. I sat up, gripping the knife, my heart pounding so hard it felt like my ribs would crack. Then something changed. The footsteps stopped at the window, right beside my bed. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Whoever or whatever it was stood there for a long time. Then, slowly, I heard them move again, back toward the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my bag, loaded it into my truck, and took one last look at the cabin. That's when I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the trees to my window, and another set leading back into the woods. Whoever had been watching me hadn't just been passing by. They had been coming back, night after night. I didn't stay to find out why. I got in my truck, drove down that winding road, and didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I never reported it, never told anyone. I didn't want to think about what might have happened if I had stayed one more night. I just knew I would never go back. Why I rented the cabin. Maybe I needed a break from everything, from people, from the noise of the city, from the feeling that life was passing too fast. The listing said it was secluded, deep in the woods, no neighbors, no distractions. That sounded perfect at the time. Now I regret it. The drive took longer than I expected. The roads got worse the deeper I went, from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, then barely a path at all. The trees pressed in on both sides, blocking out the sky. My GPS had stopped working an hour ago, but I followed the directions I had written down. I hadn't seen another car in at least 2 hours. Felt like I had left the world behind. When I finally reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no wind in the trees, just my own breathing and the faint ticking of my cooling engine. The place was small, old, made of dark wood that had turned almost black with age. There was a porch with a single chair and a window looking out over the clearing. The trees loomed behind it, thick and unbroken. I grabbed my bags and went inside. The air was stale, like the place had been closed up for too long. There was a kitchen, a small living room with an old couch and a wood stove, and a bedroom with a single bed pushed against the wall. The bathroom was tiny, just a toilet and a sink. No shower. The cabin was basic, just as the listing had said. Felt empty, like no one had been here in a long time. I spent the first hour unpacking, setting up my things, making the place feel a little less like a stranger's forgotten home. I checked my phone. No service. Not surprising, but still unsettling. I had told a few people where I was going, just in case. It would have to be enough. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the trees. The darkness came fast out here, swallowing everything. The sky was clear, filled with stars I never saw in the city. It was peaceful, or it should have been, but there was something about the silence that made me uneasy, like the woods were listening. I went inside and locked the door. The lock was old, the kind with a key you turn from the inside. It didn't feel strong. I pushed a chair against the door, just in case. I felt stupid doing it, but I did it anyway. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, not sure why. The cabin was pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face. I listened, holding my breath. First, there was nothing. Then a sound, a soft scraping, somewhere outside. Then a thud, like something heavy hitting wood. I didn't move. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, a branch falling, something harmless. But my body didn't believe it. My body told me something was wrong. Another thud, closer this time, right outside the door. I reached for my flashlight, the one I had put next to the bed. My fingers found it cold and solid. I turned it on and pointed it at the door. Nothing, just wood and shadows. Then I heard breathing. Not mine, not inside, outside. Someone was standing on the porch. I stayed frozen, waiting for something to happen. For whoever it was to knock, to say something, to try the handle. But there was nothing, just that slow, steady breathing. Then the breathing stopped. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting. My ears strained for any sound, any hint of movement. But there was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and somehow I fell asleep. The next morning, everything looked normal. No footprints on the porch, no signs that anyone had been there. I told myself it had been my imagination, maybe a dream, maybe just paranoia from being alone in a strange place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I went for a walk, staying close to the cabin, not wanting to get lost. The woods were dense, the paths barely visible. I found an old shed half hidden by trees, its door hanging open. Inside, there were rusted tools, a broken chair, and a pile of old clothes. Something about it made my skin crawl. Felt wrong. I left quickly. That night, I locked the door again, pushed the chair back against it. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the breathing came back, closer this time, right outside the bedroom window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The flashlight was in my hand, but I was too afraid to turn it on. I didn't want to see. Then the handle of the front door rattled. Slowly, carefully, like someone was testing it. I gripped the flashlight so hard my hand hurt. The chair was still against the door. The lock was still in place. But I knew that if the person outside really wanted to get in, that old wood wouldn't stop them. The handle rattled again, then stopped. Silence. Then a soft click. Not from the door, from the window. I turned on the flashlight. Nothing. Just the window still closed, still locked. But I knew what I had heard. Someone had tried to open it. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't sleep. To first light, I packed my bags. I didn't care that I had paid for a full week. I didn't care about anything except leaving. When I stepped onto the porch, I stopped. There were footprints, bare footprints pressed into the dirt, leading up to the door, and then back into the woods. I didn't think. I just ran to my car, threw my bags inside, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until I saw other cars, other people, until I was back in a world that made sense. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this. I wasn't alone in those woods, and I never will be again. I didn't want to spend the weekend in the cabin, but I didn't have much of a choice. My cousin, Mark, had been pestering me for weeks about it. He'd just bought the place dirt cheap from some old guy who was too eager to sell. A little red flag, if you ask me, but Mark was the type to jump on a good deal without thinking too much. He kept talking about how peaceful it was, how isolated, how perfect for a break from the world. I wasn't really in the mood for a trip. Work had been draining me, and the idea of driving out to the middle of nowhere wasn't appealing. But Mark wouldn't let it go. He even dangled the whole no-cell reception thing like it was a perk. A real escape, he called it. So, against my better judgment, I packed a bag and drove out on Friday night. The drive was long, mostly winding roads that got narrower the deeper I went. Trees swallowed both sides of the road, stretching up so high they blocked out the sky. I passed a gas station about an hour before the cabin, the last sign of civilization. I should have topped off the tank, but I figured I had enough. I figured a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. By the time I got there, the sun was dipping low behind the trees. The cabin was small but sturdy looking, wooden with a wraparound porch and a single light glowing from the front. Mark had left the key under a loose board on the step, just like he said. When I went inside, the air was thick with dust and the kind of silence that made my ears ring. The place was basic. A living room with a couch and an old wood-burning stove. A tiny kitchen with just enough space for a fridge and a counter. One bedroom, one bathroom. Everything smelled faintly of mildew. Mark had stocked the fridge with beer and a couple of steaks. There was even a pile of firewood stacked neatly by the stove. It looked like he'd put in some effort to make me comfortable. That made me feel a little guilty for how much I already wanted to leave. The first night was uneventful. I built a small fire, cooked one of the steaks, and sat on the porch in the dark, listening to the forest. The quiet was unsettling, but nothing felt outright wrong. It was around midnight when I went to bed. The mattress was stiff, and the blankets smelled a little stale, but I was exhausted from the drive. Sleep came quickly, then something woke me up. At first, I wasn't sure why I was awake. The room was pitch black. My breath felt loud in my ears. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving outside the cabin. I sat up slowly, my heartbeat picking up. The sound came again, closer this time. I reached for my phone, but of course, there was no service. I cursed under my breath. Then the noise stopped. For a long time, I just sat there, staring into the darkness. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. An animal, maybe, a raccoon or a deer. I lay back down but kept the blanket pulled up tight around me. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I stepped outside and scanned the area. The ground was damp from the night air, and the trees were still. Nothing seemed out of place. I told myself I'd just been paranoid. I made some coffee, ate a granola bar, and tried to enjoy the peace Mark had promised. By midday, I decided to take a walk. The forest was thick, but there was a narrow path leading away from the cabin. I followed it, stepping carefully over fallen branches and patches of wet leaves. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Even the birds seemed to disappear. About 20 minutes in, I found something strange. It was a small clearing, but the ground was torn up, like something had been dragged through the dirt. The grass was flattened, and there were deep grooves in the earth, like claw marks. I crouched down, touching the disturbed soil. It was fresh. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a bear had been digging for food, but something about it felt wrong, like the ground had been disturbed by something with intention. I stood up quickly and started back toward the cabin. The rest of the day was tense. Every little noise made me jump. The creak of the porch, the wind shifting the trees. Even my own footsteps sounded too loud. I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to me, like the woods were watching. That night, I barely slept. The noises started again, only this time, they were closer. I heard twigs snapping, slow and deliberate. I heard something brushing against the side of the cabin. I didn't move. I just lay there, my breathing shallow, gripping the blanket like a lifeline. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. When morning came, I knew I had to leave. I packed my bag in record time, throwing everything into it without care. I grabbed my keys and stepped outside. The ground in front of the cabin was disturbed. Deep marks in the dirt. Not footprints, not tire tracks. Just long, deep grooves leading away into the trees. My stomach twisted. My hands shook as I locked the door behind me. I got into my car and turned the key. Nothing. The engine clicked but wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again. The gas gauge was lower than I remembered. Almost empty. I swore under my breath. I should have filled up at the gas station. I should have left the night before. My only option was to walk. The gas station was about an hour away by car. On foot, it would take at least 5 hours, probably more. But staying in the cabin wasn't an option. I grabbed my backpack and started walking. The forest felt different. The silence was heavier. The trees seemed closer together. Every step felt like I was being watched. After about an hour, I heard something behind me, a soft rustling. I froze. I turned slowly. Nothing. I picked up my pace. The sound came again, closer this time. I broke into a jog, then a run. The rustling turned into full-on movement. Something was behind me. I didn't look. I just ran. Branches slapped my face. My lungs burned. My legs ached, but I didn't stop. I ran until I saw the road. The sun was higher now, and the sight of the open space filled me with a kind of desperate relief. I stumbled onto the asphalt, gasping for air, and then I heard it. Not footsteps, not breathing, just silence. I turned back. The trees were still. The forest was empty. I kept walking, forcing myself not to look back again. By the time I reached the gas station, my legs were shaking. The attendant gave me a strange look but didn't ask any questions as I paid for a gas can. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't say a word. I filled up my car and drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Mark called me that night asking how the trip went. I told him the cabin was fine. I didn't go back. I don't know why I ever thought coming out here alone was a good idea. Maybe I needed the space. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself. Either way, I was here now, stuck in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees, cold air, and an eerie kind of silence that made me wish I had never left home. The cabin wasn't much, just a small wooden structure deep in the woods, about 20 miles from the nearest town. I found it online, one of those places that barely had a description, just a few blurry photos and a low price. It seemed perfect at the time, a cheap escape from everything. But now, standing in front of it, staring at the weathered wooden walls and the sagging roof, I felt a pit in my stomach. It wasn't just the way it looked, it was the way the place felt. The air around it was still, like the trees were holding their breath. The sky had started to dim, the sun dipping behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the ground. I shook off the uneasy feeling and went inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and damp earth. Dust floated in the air, catching the last of the sunlight slipping through the cracks in the walls. The furniture was minimal. A creaky wooden table, a single chair, a sagging couch pushed against the far wall. The bedroom was just a narrow space with a bed that looked like it hadn't been slept in for years. The mattress was thin, the sheets stiff with dust. There was no electricity, just a few old lanterns and a wood-burning stove that I'd have to figure out how to use. I set my bag down and started unpacking. I'd only brought the essentials: some canned food, a flashlight, a hunting knife, a few changes of clothes. My phone was useless out here. No signal, no Wi-Fi, just me and the silence. That first night, I barely slept. The wind outside sounded wrong, almost like it was whispering against the walls. The trees creaked, shifting in the darkness. Every little sound had me sitting up, my heart pounding, my knife clenched in my hand. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But that feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. By the second day, I started noticing little things. The food in my bag had been moved, but I couldn't remember touching it. The chair at the table wasn't where I'd left it. The front door, which I had locked before going to bed, was unlocked in the morning. I tried to tell myself I was just forgetting things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. The dirt outside the cabin was soft from the rain, and there, clear as day, were footprints leading from the trees to my front door. Bare footprints, human. I stood there, staring at them, my skin crawling. They led right up to my door but didn't lead away. Whoever had made them had either gone inside or was still out there, watching. I didn't know what to do. I had no way to call for help. My car was parked a good 10-minute walk from the cabin, hidden off the narrow dirt road that led here. If I left, I'd be exposed, vulnerable. But staying inside didn't feel much safer. That night, I barricaded the door with the chair and kept my knife close. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound outside made my muscles tense. The wind had picked up, and somewhere in the distance, I heard something moving through the trees. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on dried leaves. Then silence. I held my breath, listening. The room was pitch black except for the faint glow of the lantern I had left on. I strained my ears, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. And then I heard it. Something scraping against the wooden walls outside. Slow, purposeful, like fingertips dragging across the surface. My heart hammered in my chest. I gripped the knife so tight my knuckles ached. The sound moved, shifting from one side of the cabin to the other. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but I couldn't force my legs to move. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scraping noise was gone. The wind howled outside, shaking the walls, but I didn't hear anything else. I waited, every nerve in my body on edge, until exhaustion finally dragged me into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Something was rotting. I sat up, my pulse hammering. The room was dim, the morning light filtering through the cracks. I could still smell it, thick, putrid, like meat left out in the sun too long. I stood, knife still in hand, and moved toward the window. I hesitated before looking out, and then I saw it. Right there, just beyond the tree line, was something hanging. I stepped back, bile rising in my throat. A deer, or what was left of it. Its body was torn open, its insides spilling onto the ground. The head was missing. Someone had done this, and they had left it for me to see. I needed to leave. I grabbed my bag, shoving everything inside with shaking hands. The chair was still braced against the door, untouched. I hadn't imagined last night. I didn't bother locking the door behind me. I sprinted to my car, my breath fogging in the cold morning air. The forest felt too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just that heavy, unnatural silence. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat. I finally got the door open and threw myself inside, locking it. My breathing was ragged as I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life. Relief flooded through me, and then I saw it. In my rearview mirror, just for a second, something moved between the trees. A figure, watching. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I slammed my foot on the gas and tore down the dirt road, not caring if I wrecked the suspension. I just needed to get out. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still shaking as I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart. I didn't call the cops. What would I even say? That I rented a cabin in the middle of nowhere and someone left a mutilated deer outside my door? That someone had been watching me? There was no proof, no footprints, no photos. Just a sickening feeling in my gut that told me I had been lucky to get out when I did. I never went back. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. I never wanted to be out there alone. I told myself it would be fine, that I needed the space, the quiet. But as I sit here, my hands shaking, my ears straining for any sound outside the cabin walls, I know I made a mistake. The cabin belonged to my uncle, a simple wooden structure deep in the woods, far from any main roads. No electricity, no running water, just a fireplace, a cot, and a few basic supplies. He used it for hunting trips, but after he passed, it just sat there. I needed a break from everything, so I figured a few weeks of solitude would help clear my head. The drive out took nearly 4 hours. The last hour was spent on a dirt road so rough I thought my car would break down. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, almost fragile in the vast emptiness of the woods. The first night was uneventful. I set up my sleeping bag on the cot, lit a few candles, and listened to the sounds of the forest outside. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, leaves rustling in the wind. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds. But by the second night, something felt off. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding, unsure why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim orange glow around the cabin. I strained my ears, listening. At first, all I heard was the wind. But then, there it was, a sound just outside. Soft, deliberate crunching. Footsteps. I held my breath. A deer? Maybe? A bear? I reached for the rifle my uncle kept in the cabin, just in case. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal as I sat up, trying to peer through the darkness outside. Nothing. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt. Human, barefoot. The prints circled the cabin, stopping just beneath the window where I slept. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe some hiker got lost. Maybe someone was messing with me. But it didn't make sense. The nearest town was over 30 miles away, and the only road leading here was barely drivable. I hadn't seen another car, another person, since I arrived. I wanted to leave, but my car wouldn't start. The battery was fine. The gas tank was full. The engine just wouldn't turn over. Panic set in fast. I had no way to call for help. My phone had no service, and even if I walked, it would take over a day to reach the main road. I checked my supplies, enough food and water for maybe a week. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I'd figure it out in the morning. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and sat by the window, the rifle in my lap. The hours dragged. The wind howled outside. The fire crackled. And then footsteps, closer this time, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, staring at the door. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a soft scraping sound, like nails dragging against wood. I wanted to call out, to yell, to let whoever it was know I was armed. But my throat was dry, my body frozen. I gripped the rifle tighter and waited. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Eventually, the sounds stopped, but I didn't sleep. Morning came. I stepped outside, my heart hammering. More footprints, the same bare feet, circling the cabin again and again. I checked the car. The hood was open. The engine was gone. Someone had taken it. Someone had been watching me, waiting until I was asleep to take apart my only way out. I spent the day trying to figure out what to do. I had no choice but to walk. I packed what little I could carry, a few bottles of water, some food, the rifle. I left as soon as the sun started to set, hoping the cover of darkness would keep me hidden. I didn't make it far. Less than a mile in, I heard them, footsteps behind me, matching my pace. I turned, rifle raised. Nothing but trees. I kept moving. The footsteps followed. Closer now. Faster. I ran. My pack slammed against my back with every step, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wasn't thinking, wasn't planning, just running. And then I saw it. A figure, standing between the trees, just ahead. I skidded to a stop, my heart in my throat. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. I raised the rifle. My hands were shaking. I shouted something, anything. They didn't respond, didn't flinch. I fired. The shot rang through the forest. Birds exploded from the trees. My ears rang, and the figure, gone. I turned and ran back to the cabin, bolting the door behind me. I barely had time to catch my breath before I heard it again. Footsteps, surrounding the cabin. More than one this time. I don't know how long I sat there, rifle aimed at the door, waiting. But the door never opened. The footsteps never came inside. Morning came. Silence. I stepped outside, half expecting to see them still standing there. But there was nothing. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there at all. I didn't question it. I ran. I walked for hours. The sun was high when I finally stumbled onto the road, exhausted, delirious. A truck passed by, slowing when the driver saw me. He asked if I was okay, if I needed help. I told him I just needed to go home. I never went back to that cabin, never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I hear the footsteps, and I wonder if they ever stopped following me. Why I even agreed to this trip. I don't like the woods. I don't like being out in the middle of nowhere, far from other people, with nothing but trees stretching in every direction. But I let my friend, Mark, talk me into it. "It'll be good for you," he said. "A weekend alone in the wilderness. Just you, nature, and the sound of nothing." I should have known better. The drive up was uneventful, though the roads got rougher the deeper I went. Asphalt turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to something that barely passed as a road at all. My car, an old but reliable sedan, was struggling by the time I reached the cabin. I had to push through thick, overgrown brush to even find the driveway. The trees here were taller than any I'd seen before, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The cabin itself was exactly what I expected. Small, weathered, and isolated. A single-story structure with a covered porch and a pitched roof. It had been abandoned for years before Mark's uncle bought it. He used it for hunting trips, but he hadn't been up here in a while. That much was obvious. The wood was gray and dry, the windows were streaked with grime, and the front door groaned when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. The main room had a couch, a wood-burning stove, and a table with 2 chairs. A tiny kitchen was tucked into the corner. There was a single bedroom and a bathroom, both just as neglected as the rest of the place. I dropped my bag on the couch and went to open a window, letting in the crisp autumn air. I spent the first couple of hours settling in. I checked the cabinets for supplies, canned food mostly. Mark's uncle had left a few things behind, but I had brought my own. I made sure the generator worked, then started a small fire in the stove. The warmth was nice, but it didn't do much to ease the unease I felt. Something about this place was wrong. I told myself it was just the silence. I wasn't used to it. No cars in the distance, no hum of electricity, no voices from passing neighbors. Just the wind through the trees, the occasional creak of wood, and the distant hoot of an owl. I ate a quick meal, read for a bit, then decided to turn in early. I had brought my own sleeping bag and laid it out on the couch rather than use the dusty old bed. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I closed my eyes, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to convince myself that I was safe. I woke up around 2 a.m. First, I didn't know why. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the cabin was cold. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me and closed my eyes again. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something brushing against the outside of the cabin. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. It moved along the wall, past the window toward the front door. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't the random, careless movement of a wild animal. It was careful, intentional. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The sound stopped. Minutes passed. Then 3 slow knocks. Not loud, not forceful. Just a light tapping, like someone was testing the door. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My body was frozen with fear. The knocking stopped, and the scraping started again, moving around the cabin. I thought about grabbing the hunting rifle Mark's uncle kept here, but it was locked in a case, and I wasn't sure I could load it fast enough. I just lay there listening, waiting, praying. Then silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. When the sun finally started to rise, I forced myself to move. I got up, checked the locks, and peered outside. There were no footprints in the dirt, no sign that anything had been there at all. Maybe I imagined it. That's what I told myself. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe I was just paranoid, alone in a strange place. I almost convinced myself it was nothing, until I saw the scratches on the window. Long, deep marks carved into the glass. Not random, not natural. 5 parallel lines like the fingers of a hand. Something had been here. I packed my things and left without looking back. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods for a week. It was supposed to be a break from everything, the city, the noise, the stress. I just wanted some peace and quiet. The listing was simple, just a few photos of a modest wooden cabin surrounded by dense trees. A short description saying it had the basics: a bed, a bathroom, a small kitchen, and a fireplace. That was all I needed. The drive there took longer than I expected. The road started as pavement but eventually turned to dirt, winding through thick trees that seemed to swallow the sunlight. My GPS stopped working miles before I arrived, but I had printed directions just in case. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked just like the pictures. Small, isolated, and surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. There was no cell service. I expected that, but it still felt a little unsettling. I reassured myself this was what I wanted. No distractions, no calls, no emails. Just me, the quiet, and time to clear my head. The first night was peaceful. I made a simple meal, read a book by the fireplace, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. The only sound was the occasional creaking of the wood as the cabin settled. It was the kind of quiet I hadn't experienced in years. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to go for a walk. There was no real path, just trees stretching in every direction. I walked for maybe an hour, taking in the fresh air, the scent of pine, the crunch of leaves under my boots. But then I realized I wasn't sure which way the cabin was. I stood still for a moment, trying to calm the rising panic. I hadn't walked in a straight line. I had taken turns, stepped over fallen logs, walked around thick patches of brush. I hadn't marked my way. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps. Everything looked the same. I walked in what I thought was the right direction, but after 10 minutes, I knew I was wrong. I wasn't lost. I had a general idea of the direction I'd come from. But as I kept walking, that confidence faded. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, and I felt like I was walking in circles. Then, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A piece of rope tied around a tree. A simple, weathered rope, knotted tightly, about shoulder height. It didn't belong there. Someone had put it there. I tried to push the thought away. Maybe it was for hiking, maybe it was just a marker. But it didn't look fresh. It looked old, like it had been there for years. And I didn't remember seeing it when I had first started walking. I kept going, trying to keep my breathing steady. The sun was still high. I had plenty of time to find my way back before dark. I walked faster. Then I saw another rope. Same kind, same knot, tied at the same height. My chest tightened. It was the same rope, the exact same one. I had walked in a big circle without realizing it. I forced myself to stop, to think. Panicking would only make things worse. I needed to pay attention, to move in a straight line, to use the sun as a guide. I picked a direction and stuck to it, walking as straight as I could, making sure I didn't turn. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted the cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me. I jogged the last few steps, slammed the door shut behind me, and locked it. My heart was still pounding. I told myself I was being paranoid, that getting turned around was normal, that the rope meant nothing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every small noise made me flinch. The trees outside rustled in the wind, but I kept imagining footsteps. I reminded myself how far I was from civilization. There was no one out here. But the next morning, I saw something that made my stomach twist into knots. Footprints, in the dirt outside the cabin. They weren't mine. My boots had a distinct tread, but these were different, wider, deeper. Someone had been here. I checked the door. Still locked. Windows, still shut. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been disturbed. But someone had stood outside my cabin, sometime in the night. I wanted to leave, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe a hiker had wandered through. Maybe the footprints had been there before I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed. I had no proof of anything. I decided to stay, but that night, I barely slept again. The wind howled through the trees, and I kept imagining movement outside. Every creak, every rustle sent my heart racing. On the fourth night, I woke up suddenly, not because of a sound, but because of the absence of one. The wind had stopped. The trees were still. The entire forest was silent. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Then, just as I was starting to calm down, I heard it, a soft creak, like a footstep on the wooden porch. I froze. My blood turned ice. My mind raced, trying to come up with any explanation that wasn't the one I feared. Another creak, closer to the door. I reached for the small knife I had brought with me, gripping it so tightly my hand hurt. My breath was shallow, barely there. Then the doorknob moved. Not violently, not a pounding or rattling, just a slow, careful turn, testing if it was locked. I couldn't move. I just sat there in the dark, gripping the knife, listening. The knob stopped moving. Silence stretched. Then soft footsteps, leaving the porch, moving away. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake until the first light of morning. As soon as the sun was up, I grabbed my things, threw them into my bag, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't breathe until I was miles away. When I got home, I checked the listing for the cabin again. It was gone, completely removed, like it had never existed. The contact info for the owner was disconnected. There was no trace of it. I don't know who was out there with me. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't want to know. I just know I'll never go back to the woods again. A month ago, my life had been normal: work, rent, bills, the usual. Then everything fell apart. I lost my job first, then my apartment. I had no savings. The only thing I owned outright was my truck, and I was about a week away from living in it. That's when I remembered the cabin. It belonged to my uncle, though he'd been dead for years. Sat deep in the woods, far from anything. He used it for hunting, but no one had touched it since he passed. My mother still technically owned it, but she hadn't been out there in over a decade. It was old, it was run down, but it was shelter, and it was free. I packed up what little I had left, grabbed a few supplies, and drove out. The dirt road leading there was rough, covered in potholes and half swallowed by the trees. When I finally reached the clearing, the sight of the cabin made my stomach sink. The place looked worse than I remembered. Half the roof sagged, the front steps were rotted, and the whole thing leaned slightly, like it was tired of standing. But I didn't have a choice. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. There was no electricity, no running water. Just a fireplace, a wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a small cot in the corner. Mice had chewed through parts of the walls, and I could hear them skittering somewhere deeper in. I told myself I'd deal with them later. Right now, I just needed sleep. That first night, I lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling. The forest outside was alive with noise. Branches creaking, leaves rustling, the distant howl of some animal. I wasn't used to the silence between those sounds. No cars, no hum of a refrigerator, no distant voices. Just emptiness. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a noise outside. A snap like a branch breaking underfoot. I sat up, heart hammering. The cabin had no locks, just a simple latch. If someone wanted to get in, they could. I held my breath, listening. Another crunch. Closer. I reached for the hunting knife I kept beside me. I didn't call out. If someone was out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake. I waited, every muscle tensed. Then nothing. The sound stopped. After a long, painful minute, I let myself breathe again. Maybe just an animal. Maybe a deer passing through. The next morning, I found tracks near the tree line. Deep, heavy footprints. Too big for a deer. Too defined to be something random. Someone had been out there. I spent the day reinforcing what I could. I nailed some extra boards over the windows, moved the table in front of the door at night. It wouldn't stop someone determined, but it would slow them down. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. The tracks could have been old. Maybe some hunter passing through weeks ago. But I knew that wasn't true. I knew fresh tracks when I saw them. That night, I kept the knife in my hand as I lay in bed. I barely slept. Every sound outside made my pulse jump. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to something much worse. Breathing. Not mine. Not an animal's. Just outside the window, slow and steady. Someone standing there, watching. I stayed completely still. The breathing continued. Then a hand pressing against the glass. My whole body went cold. The cabin was isolated. No one should be out here. No one. The hand stayed there for what felt like hours. Then finally it pulled away. The breathing stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I sat there, gripping my knife until my hand ached. The sun couldn't come up fast enough. When it finally did, I went outside. No tracks this time. No sign of anything. But I knew what I heard. I knew what I saw. Someone had been there. I checked my truck. Still there, untouched. I thought about leaving, but where would I go? I had nowhere else. The cabin was all I had left. That night, I sat in the dark with the knife in my lap. I didn't sleep. I waited, listened. Around 2 a.m., the sounds started again. Footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate. They stopped at the door. Then a whisper. Low. Just one word. Open. My whole body locked up. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. The whisper came again, barely audible. Open. I gripped the knife tighter. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I stayed frozen. The whispering stopped. Footsteps moved away. Silence. Morning came. I packed my things. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to go. But when I reached my truck, I found it. All 4 tires. Slashed. Whoever was out there, they weren't just watching. They wanted me to stay. I grabbed my knife and my flashlight and started walking. The nearest town was miles away, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of those woods. I walked for hours. The sun was dipping low when I finally reached the road. My legs ached. My throat was dry, but I was safe. I kept walking until I found a gas station, stumbled inside, and told the clerk everything. He called the police. They never found anyone. No footprints, no signs of another person. My truck was still there when they checked, tires destroyed, but nothing else had been touched. I never went back. Whoever had been there that night, they wanted me to stay, and I wasn't about to find out why. I should have never gone to that cabin. I don't know why I thought it would be a good idea. Maybe it was the stress, or maybe I just wanted to prove something to myself. I always considered myself someone who could handle being alone. But there's a difference between being alone in your apartment, surrounded by the hum of distant traffic, and being alone in the middle of nowhere, where silence stretches forever. It started with an online listing. A cabin deep in the woods, completely isolated. No internet, no cell service, no distractions. It sounded perfect. I told myself I needed the break. No emails, no texts, no constant buzzing in my pocket. Just me, nature, and some quiet time. The drive was long, too long. The last stretch of road was nothing but dirt and gravel, winding through dense trees that seemed to swallow all sunlight. My car's tires kicked up dust, and every turn looked the same. No houses, no signs, just miles of unbroken forest. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. One story, dark wood, a slanted roof covered in dried leaves. A single window stared back at me, dark and empty. The front porch creaked when I stepped on it. I pushed the door open, and the air inside was stale, carrying a faint smell of damp wood and old dust. Inside, it was simple. A single bed against the wall, a small kitchen area with an old stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. A single door led to a tiny bathroom. The windows were small, the kind that barely let in any light. I set my bags down and sat on the bed, listening to the silence. It felt different here, heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The first night was uneventful, but I struggled to sleep. The quiet was too much. Every sound felt amplified, the wind against the cabin, the creak of the old wood, the rustle of leaves outside. I kept waking up, my heart pounding for no reason. The second day, I explored the area. There was nothing but trees in every direction. I walked for hours, but everything looked the same. No trails, no landmarks, just endless forest. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. It was an irrational feeling, but I couldn't shake it. The moment I turned back toward the cabin, my stomach unclenched, and I realized how tense I'd been. That night, I heard something, a soft noise barely there, a rustling, like footsteps just outside the cabin. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I waited, straining my ears, but there was nothing, just the wind, just my imagination. I told myself it was an animal. On the third day, I found something strange. A little way from the cabin, the ground had been disturbed. The dirt was uneven, like something had been dragged. I crouched down, running my fingers through the soil. It was fresh. Something had been here recently. That night, I locked the door. I had done it the other nights, but this time I double-checked. I pushed a chair against it just in case. I lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening, waiting. The sound came again, closer this time, a shuffle, slow and deliberate. I held my breath. The sound moved around the cabin, stopping just beneath my window. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would shake the bed. I didn't move. I couldn't move. Then silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen in place. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found footprints outside my window. Not boot prints, not animal tracks, bare feet, human. The dirt was disturbed, showing slow, deliberate steps leading from the tree line to my cabin, stopping just beneath the window where I had been sleeping. I packed my bags immediately. My hands were shaking as I threw everything into my backpack. I didn't care about the food, didn't care about the supplies. I just wanted to leave, but my car wouldn't start. I turned the key, and the engine clicked, coughed, but refused to turn over. I tried again, and again. Nothing. Panic set in. I was stuck. I grabbed my phone even though I knew there was no signal. Nothing. No way to call for help. No way to reach anyone. The road was miles of empty forest, and I had no idea which direction would lead me back to civilization. I decided to wait until daylight. I would walk if I had to. I would find a way out. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the door, gripping the only weapon I had, a rusted kitchen knife from the drawer. Every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The soft shuffle of footsteps. Slow, patient. Coming closer. A shadow passed in front of the window. Couldn't breathe. My grip on the knife tightened. Then a knock. Soft. 3 taps against the wood. I stayed completely still. Another knock. Louder this time. 3 steady taps. The doorknob rattled. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the first light of morning crept through the window. I forced myself to move, to open the door. There was nothing there, just the empty clearing, the trees, the wind. But in the dirt, leading away from the cabin, were footprints. Bare, human footprints. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just ran. Through the trees, down the road, as far as my legs would carry me. I didn't stop until I found a highway, until a passing driver pulled over and called for help. When I returned with a tow truck, the cabin was empty. My things were still inside. My car started on the first try, but the footprints were still there. I never found out who or what had been outside that cabin. I never went back, but sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still hear it. 3 soft knocks. I drove deep into the woods, further than I'd ever gone before. The road was barely a road anymore, just 2 worn-down tracks cutting through the trees. My cabin, well, not really mine, but the one I'd rented for the month, was supposed to be isolated, quiet. That was the point. I needed to be alone, away from the city, away from people. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. The air was heavy with the scent of pine. The sun had started to dip below the trees, casting long, jagged shadows across the dirt path. My tires crunched over gravel as I finally reached the clearing. The cabin stood there, small and dark, nestled between towering pines. It looked exactly like the photos. Wooden, a little weathered, but sturdy. A porch wrapped around the front, and the single window to the right of the door reflected the last of the light. I cut the engine and sat there for a moment, listening. Nothing, just the wind rustling the branches, the distant call of some bird I couldn't name. Perfect. The door groaned as I stepped out. The air was cooler here than in the city. Crisp. I grabbed my bags from the trunk, locking the car more out of habit than necessity. Who the hell would be out here? There was no one for miles, according to the listing. The key was under a loose stone beside the steps, just like the owner had told me. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, immediately hit with the smell of old wood and dust. The inside was simple. A main room with a couch, a fireplace, a small kitchen in the back, a single bedroom to the left, the bathroom to the right. I dropped my bags by the couch and walked over to the kitchen. The tap sputtered before water finally came out, murky at first, then clear. At least the plumbing worked. As the last bit of sunlight faded, I lit the lanterns placed around the room. There was electricity, but the guy who rented it to me had warned that the generator was unreliable. I didn't mind. I liked the dim, flickering light. It made the place feel warmer. I sat on the couch, listening to the quiet. It had been a long drive, and my body ached from sitting so long. I leaned back, stretching my arms over my head. That's when I heard it. A sound outside. Faint, barely noticeable over the wind. A crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. My body tensed, my ears straining. Another sound. Rustling, slow and deliberate. A deer, probably, or a raccoon. I forced myself to relax, but the hairs on my arms stayed raised. The silence stretched, and after a while, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Long drive, nerves adjusting to the quiet. That was all. I stood, went to the bedroom, and flicked on the light. The bed was small but looked comfortable. A single window faced the trees. I pulled the curtains closed. The wind picked up outside, making the trees groan. I changed into sweats and sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing my face. It was barely 9, but I felt drained. Then there it was again. The sound, this time closer. A deliberate movement, slow and careful. Not an animal scurrying through leaves. Something heavier. Person. I stood, heart hammering. My car keys were still by the couch. My phone was in my bag. I hesitated. The sound had stopped. Nothing but the wind again. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. I let out a slow breath, feeling ridiculous. Just the woods playing tricks on me. It had been a long time since I'd been this isolated. My senses were in overdrive. I climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chest. My breathing slowed. My body relaxed. Then, a soft creak. From the porch. My blood turned cold. The porch was wooden, old. Creaked under weight. I held my breath. Another creak. Someone was out there, standing on my porch. I sat up slowly, moving as quietly as I could. My bag was just a few feet away. I reached for it, fingers closing around my phone. No signal. I clenched my jaw. The listing had warned about that. No service this deep in the woods. I listened, heart pounding. Silence. Then, a new sound. The doorknob, turning. Slowly. I froze, every muscle in my body locked. The door was locked. The key was in my pocket. But the knob kept turning, rattling slightly, as if whoever was outside was testing it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then it stopped. Silence. A long pause. Then, footsteps. Moving away. Slow. Measured. Fading into the trees. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. Sitting in the dark, gripping my phone so hard my hand hurt. Finally, when I couldn't hear anything else, I crept to the window and lifted the curtain just enough to peek outside. The porch was empty. The trees beyond were just shadows. Nothing, but someone had been there, and now they were gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept every light on, sitting with my back against the wall, waiting. Morning came slow. When the first light touched the trees, I stepped outside, scanning the ground. Footprints. Clear, deep footprints leading from the woods to my porch. But no footprints leading away. Whoever had been here never left. They were still out there, watching, waiting, and I wasn't alone. I never liked the idea of staying alone in the woods, but the cabin seemed like the perfect escape. After months of stress and sleepless nights in the city, I wanted silence, a place where I could clear my head. The drive was long, almost 5 hours from home, deep into an area where cell service became unreliable. That part didn't bother me much. I needed a break from everything. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, someone I barely knew. He said he barely used it anymore and offered it cheap. The pictures looked decent, and I figured it would be nice to spend a week away from the noise. I packed enough food and supplies for the whole trip, not wanting to make any trips back into town. The last stretch of the drive was rough. The dirt road leading to the cabin was barely a road at all, just a strip of land cutting through thick trees. The deeper I drove, the more isolated I felt. No other houses, no streetlights, nothing but trees pressing in from both sides. It was the kind of place where no one would hear you if you screamed. The cabin itself looked just like the pictures. Small, old, but sturdy. A single-floor structure with a slanted roof, a wooden porch, and a chimney. The inside was basic. A kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, a single bedroom, and a small bathroom. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and my phone had zero service. Just the way I wanted it. I settled in quickly, unpacking my things and lighting the fireplace before the sun dipped behind the trees. The air outside turned cold fast, and the silence was almost too much. I could hear every creak of the wood, every gust of wind against the windows. Took some getting used to, but I reminded myself this was the peace I came for. The first night was uneventful. I read for a while, ate a simple meal, and went to bed early. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire and the wind outside. But something about the way the trees moved in the darkness unsettled me. I kept the curtains closed. On the second day, I decided to explore a little. There was a lake about a mile from the cabin, according to the map my friend gave me. The trail was overgrown but easy to follow. As I walked, I noticed little things. Tree stumps with strange carvings, an old, rusted canteen hanging from a branch, shotgun shells scattered near a fallen log. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was walking through someone else's space, as if I wasn't really alone out there. I reached the lake in the afternoon. It was beautiful, untouched, the water still and dark. No signs of boats or docks, just nature at its purest. I sat there for a while, enjoying the quiet, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Heading back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every few steps, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing, just trees, shadows shifting in the wind. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. That night, I woke up suddenly. No sound, no reason, just wide awake. The cabin was pitch black except for the dim orange glow of the fireplace. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it. Something outside. Soft, slow footsteps in the dirt. I held my breath. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but the steps were too careful, too deliberate. They stopped near the porch. Then a soft creak, like weight pressing on wood. Someone was there. I reached for the hunting knife I brought, my heart hammering. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Then more steps, this time moving away, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I checked outside. No footprints, nothing disturbed. Maybe I imagined it, maybe not. Either way, I wasn't going to take chances. I kept my knife on me for the rest of the day. On the fourth night, it happened again. But this time, it was worse. I woke up to a sound directly outside my window. A slow, dragging noise, like something being pulled through the dirt. Then a soft tap. A single tap against the glass. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My body went cold. The tap came again. Then silence. I lay there for what felt like hours before I finally worked up the courage to move. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the window. Nothing. Just trees and darkness. I barely slept after that. I wanted to leave, but driving that dirt road at night wasn't an option. I told myself I'd go in the morning, first thing. The morning came and I packed fast. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something near the steps. A long, thin piece of rope, knotted at one end. It hadn't been there before. That was it. I got in my car and left without looking back. I never told my friend what happened. Never asked who else might know about the cabin. I just know I'll never go back. Some places aren't meant for people like me. Some places belong to something else. I don't know how long I had been awake, staring at the ceiling of that old cabin, listening. The wind outside had died down, leaving only the occasional creak of the wooden walls settling in the cold. It was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing, slow and steady, despite the weight pressing against my chest. Something wasn't right. I had come out here for solitude, a break from everything. The city had been suffocating, the noise, the crowds, the constant feeling that I was wasting my life staring at screens and listening to people talk about things that didn't matter. So when I found an ad for a cabin rental deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, it seemed perfect. It wasn't fancy, just a single room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bed pushed up against the far wall. No electricity, no running water, just a hand pump outside and a wood stove for heat. At first, it had been peaceful. I spent my days hiking, reading, chopping wood. At night, I would sit by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. The first couple of nights, I slept like a rock. But then, something changed. It started with small things. The first night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't an animal. I knew what deer and raccoons sounded like. This was different. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching in the frost-covered leaves just beyond the window. I lay in bed, barely breathing, listening as they circled the cabin. When I finally got the nerve to sit up and look, there was nothing there, just the dark forest pressing in from all sides. The next morning, I found footprints, human footprints. They started at the tree line and led right up to the cabin before stopping near the window. I stood there for a long time, just staring at them, trying to make sense of it. It didn't make any sense. No one should be out here. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. I told myself it was some hiker who had wandered too far, maybe just curious about the cabin. But deep down, I didn't believe that. There were no return tracks leading away from the cabin, only the ones coming in. That night, I locked the door and barred it with one of the heavy wooden chairs. I kept the fire going, but every time I started to drift off, I'd wake up to some sound outside, a branch snapping, leaves rustling, the soft crunch of footsteps moving closer, then stopping. I didn't sleep. The third night was worse. Around midnight, I heard something brush against the cabin wall. It was slow, like someone running their fingers along the wood. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Then, a soft tapping against the window. Not knocking, just tapping. Light, rhythmic. My blood went cold. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the dark shape behind the glass. It was hard to make out, but there was something there. A shadow. Person. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. I don't know how long I sat there before they finally turned and walked away. I listened to the sound of their footsteps fading into the trees. Then silence. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside. The ground was covered in fresh snow, and there, leading from the trees to the window, were more footprints. They hadn't come from the road. They had come from the forest. I got into my truck and turned the key. Nothing. The engine wouldn't even try to turn over. I checked under the hood, but I'm not a mechanic. For all I knew, everything was fine, and it just decided to die on me at the worst possible moment. I had two choices: sit in the cabin and wait for help that might never come, or start walking. I chose to walk. I packed as much as I could carry and started down the long dirt road that led back to the highway. It was nearly 10 miles, but I could do it. I had to, At first, it felt good to be moving, putting distance between myself and the cabin. But after the first mile, I started feeling it again. That sense of being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the trees. I picked up my pace. By mile 3, I heard them. Footsteps. Behind me. Slow at first, then matching my pace. I stopped. They stopped. I started walking again, faster. They did too. Not running, not charging at me, just keeping pace, always just out of sight. I was too scared to look. I just kept moving, focusing on the road ahead, counting my steps, telling myself that if I just kept going, I would make it. Then, up ahead, I saw something in the road. My heart nearly stopped. A single set of footprints, coming from the trees and stopping in the middle of the road. They didn't go back into the woods. They just stopped. I walked past them, forcing myself not to look, not to think about what it meant. I just kept going, pushing forward, my legs aching, my breath coming in short gasps. The sun was starting to set when I finally saw the highway. Relief flooded through me. I practically ran the last 100 yards, stumbling onto the pavement, looking wildly in both directions for a car, a person, anything. There was nothing, just the empty road stretching out in both directions. I turned back toward the woods. It was quiet, too quiet. Then I saw them, a figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the fading light. Not moving, just watching. I didn't wait. I started walking down the road, faster, then faster until I was running. I ran until my legs burned, until I couldn't breathe, until the only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. When I finally saw headlights, I nearly collapsed. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms. The car slowed, a woman rolling down her window, asking if I was okay. I must have looked insane. I could barely get the words out, but she let me in, drove me to the nearest town. I never went back for my truck. I never went back for my things. I didn't care. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. I never wanted to go to the cabin alone, but life doesn't wait for the perfect moment. My brother, Dan, was supposed to come with me. We had planned it for months. A quiet getaway in the woods, away from the city noise, away from people. But work got in his way at the last minute, and I was left with a decision. Cancel the trip or go alone. I went alone. The drive was long. It took almost 5 hours, most of it through empty stretches of road that twisted through miles of dense trees. The last half hour was on an unpaved road, uneven and covered in loose gravel. I had to drive slow to keep my tires from sliding. There wasn't another car in sight. The cabin was exactly how I remembered it. Small, isolated, and old. We had rented it once before, years ago. It belonged to a friend of my father's, and it had stood there for decades, deep in the forest where no one would bother it. There was a small front porch, a slanted roof, and a single chimney. The wood was aged and dark from years of rain and wind. There were no neighbors, no roads leading past it, just trees in every direction. At night, there wouldn't be a single light besides the one I left on inside. I parked and grabbed my things. I had packed enough food for a few days, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a hunting knife, just in case. I wasn't planning to hunt, but being out here alone, it felt right to have something sharp nearby. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and dust. I dropped my bag by the couch and walked through the cabin, checking each room. There were only 3, the main living space, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with a single bed. The walls were covered in old photos and deer heads from whoever owned the place before. A fireplace sat in the corner, filled with ashes from whoever had last used it. I made a mental note to get firewood before dark. The first night was quiet, too quiet. Without the noise of cars, people, or city lights, the silence felt heavy. I could hear every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside. The trees swayed against the roof, making soft scraping noises that almost sounded like footsteps. I told myself it was just the wind. I checked the doors twice before going to bed. I woke up once, sometime in the middle of the night. Took me a second to realize why. The cabin was pitch black, my flashlight on the nightstand where I had left it. But something had woken me up. A sound. A single, distinct sound. Something had been tapping on the window. I stayed still, my breathing slow, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't the wind. Wind didn't tap. It might have been a branch, but there weren't any close enough to touch the glass. I listened for a long time, but the sound didn't come again. After a while, I forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I checked the window first thing. No marks, no scratches, just my own reflection staring back at me. Maybe I had imagined it. I spent the day keeping busy, chopping firewood, walking the perimeter of the cabin, making sure everything was how it should be. There were no signs of animals nearby, no footprints in the dirt except my own. I told myself I was just being paranoid. That night, the tapping came again. 3 taps, light but deliberate, then silence. I sat up, holding my breath, staring at the window across the room. It was too dark to see anything outside. The flashlight was within reach, but I didn't grab it. I just sat there, listening, waiting for it to happen again. Didn't. The rest of the night was sleepless. Every noise made me flinch. I checked the locks again and again, knowing deep down that a locked door wouldn't stop someone who really wanted to get in. The next morning, I found footprints. They weren't mine. They were smaller, lighter. They circled the cabin, stopping at each window before vanishing into the woods. I packed my things, fast. I didn't care if I had only planned to stay 3 more days. I wasn't staying another night. I threw my bag into the truck and climbed in, my hands shaking as I turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. I tried again. Nothing. Panic crept up my throat. The truck had been fine yesterday. The gas tank was full. The engine had no reason not to start. I popped the hood, got out, and checked the battery, the wires, anything that could have come loose. Everything looked fine. I turned around, my eyes scanning the trees, searching for movement. Nothing. I was stranded. I spent the rest of the day trying to fix the truck, but it wouldn't start. I had no signal, no way to call for help. My only option was to wait and hope someone came down the road. But no one ever came down that road. That night, the tapping came again. This time, it didn't stop after 3 taps. It moved from one window to the next. Slow, deliberate. The sound of fingers, knuckles, something soft but insistent. I sat in the dark, gripping the knife, waiting. The front door rattled. The knob turned once, twice, then silence. I didn't sleep. I sat there until morning, my body rigid, my mind racing. When the sun finally came up, I went outside with the knife still in my hand. The footprints were there again. More this time. Dozens of them circling the cabin, stopping at the doors, the windows. Some looked fresh. Some had been there before. Someone had been here for a while. I didn't know how long I had before night came again. I needed to get out. Walking wasn't an option. The nearest town was too far. But the road wasn't impossible. If I followed it long enough, I'd find help. I packed a bag with what I needed: food, water, a flashlight, extra batteries. I left everything else. I didn't care. I wasn't staying another night. I started walking. I walked fast, my eyes on the trees, the road stretching ahead of me like a lifeline. I told myself not to look back, but I did, and I saw them, figures standing in the trees, not moving, just watching, dozens of them, spaced out between the trunks, their faces hidden in the shadows. I ran. I didn't stop, didn't slow down. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I kept going. The road felt endless, but then I saw it. A truck, parked at the end of the road, an older man standing beside it, confused as I sprinted toward him, gasping for air. He asked if I was okay, if I needed help. I couldn't even speak. I just pointed back toward the trees. They were gone. He drove me to town, to safety. I never went back for my truck. I never went back to the cabin. Sometimes, though, I still hear it. 3 taps. Soft, deliberate, then silence. why I thought renting a cabin in the middle of nowhere would be a good idea. Maybe I just wanted to get away from everything for a while. Work, people, noise. I imagined peace, fresh air, and the kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself think. What I got was something else entirely. The place was about 4 hours out of the city, tucked deep into the woods where the roads turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. By the time I arrived, the sun was already sinking behind the trees, and the world had that eerie stillness that comes with dusk. I parked my car a few feet from the front porch and sat there for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. It was just me, the trees, and the cabin. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at. Small, one-story, made of old dark wood that had been left to the elements too long. The windows were dirty, reflecting only the fading light. The porch sagged a little under my weight as I stepped up to the door, unlocking it with the key I'd picked up from a tiny rental office a few miles back. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and wood. The furniture was basic, just a couch, a small table, a single chair. A short hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. There was a fireplace, but the wood stacked beside it was damp and useless. I dumped my bag on the couch and flipped the light switch. The bulbs flickered weakly before settling into a dim, yellow glow. The place felt abandoned, like no one had stayed here in a long time. I tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine. I was just being paranoid. It was an old cabin, that's all. I spent the first hour unpacking what little I'd brought. Some clothes, a book, a flashlight, a knife. I wasn't planning to be out here long, just a few nights to clear my head. After setting up my stuff, I went to check the locks. The front door was solid, the windows small and nailed shut. The back door, which led to a narrow path through the trees, had a flimsy lock, but it would do. The first night was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of life, just silence. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, ears straining for anything. An owl, a coyote, even a breeze. But there was nothing. I didn't realize how much I depended on the city noise until I was left with this emptiness. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a soft creak. Not inside the cabin, but just outside, like someone shifting their weight on the porch. I held my breath, every muscle locking up. The sound came again. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, clicking it on and pointing it toward the bedroom door. The cabin was so small that from where I lay, I could see straight into the main room. The front door was still closed. I listened for a long time, but the sound didn't come again. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside, coffee in hand, to check the porch. The wood was damp with morning dew, but something stood out, dirt. A smudge of dark earth near the door, like someone had stepped there with muddy boots. Could have been my own footprint, though I didn't remember stepping there the night before. Maybe I had. Maybe I was just spooking myself. The second night, I made sure everything was locked up tight. I even dragged a chair in front of the back door, just in case. I wasn't afraid, not really, just cautious. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling again, when I heard it, a soft, deliberate creak from the porch. My blood turned to ice. Then, something even worse. The doorknob rattled. Not the wind, not my imagination. Something or someone was trying to turn it. I moved as slowly as I could, reaching for the flashlight and the knife I'd placed beside me earlier. The rattle stopped. I sat up, holding my breath, heart hammering in my chest. Silence. Then, a soft scrape, like fingers dragging across wood. I don't know how long I sat there, gripping the knife so hard my knuckles ached. Eventually, whatever was out there left. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found more footprints. This time, they weren't smudges. They were clear, deep imprints in the damp soil around the porch. Bare feet. Who the hell walks around barefoot in the woods? I packed my bag. I was done. Whatever sense of peace I had come here looking for, I wasn't going to find it. I threw my things into the trunk, slammed it shut, and yanked open the driver's door. My hands were shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was fine, I had just driven here, but the car wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood, got out, and checked the engine, but I didn't know what I was looking for. Everything seemed fine. Then I noticed something. The hood was slightly ajar, like it had been opened and not shut properly. I hadn't touched it since I got here. Someone had been messing with my car. I was stuck. The nearest town was miles away. I had no cell service, no landline, no way to call for help. My only choice was to wait until morning and try to walk back to the rental office. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the main room with my back against the wall, knife in hand, listening. The noises started around midnight. Footsteps, soft, slow, circling the cabin. Then scratching at the back door. The chair I had wedged under the knob shifted slightly. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to break in. They were toying with me. The footsteps stopped. Then the worst sound of all. Breathing, just outside the window. Slow, deep, deliberate. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The glass was dirty, but I could see a shape standing just beyond it. Not an animal, not a shadow, person. I gripped the knife tighter, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the presence was gone. First light, I ran. I grabbed my bag and bolted. I didn't stop. Not when I heard something moving in the trees. Not when I felt eyes on me the entire way. Took me 5 hours to reach the rental office. The woman behind the desk barely looked up as I stumbled inside, gasping for breath. "You walk all the way from the cabin?" she asked, frowning. I nodded. She sighed. "Yeah, you're not the first." I left without asking what she meant. I didn't want to know. I never looked back. I never liked camping. I only went because my friend, Ben, wouldn't shut up about it. "It'll be fun," he said. "Get away from everything for a weekend." He always had that enthusiasm for things that required too much effort. I, on the other hand, liked the safety of my home, my locked doors, and my familiar surroundings. But somehow he convinced me, and that was the biggest mistake of my life. We chose a spot deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from town. Ben had been there before, said it was quiet, away from people, perfect for a real camping experience. I didn't care about that. I just wanted the weekend to pass without any trouble. We packed up the truck and left early Saturday morning. The road leading to the campsite was rough, full of potholes and loose gravel. Trees lined both sides, thick and endless. It felt like we were driving into the middle of nowhere, which, in hindsight, we were. The place was empty when we arrived. No other tents, no signs of people, just trees, dirt, and silence. Setting up camp took longer than expected. The ground was uneven, and the air felt thick, like a storm was coming. I ignored it. We set up the tent, gathered firewood, and cooked over an open flame. Felt normal for a while, even peaceful. But then, something felt off. It started with the sounds, or rather, the lack of them. The usual noises you hear in the woods. Chirping insects, rustling leaves, distant animal calls. All faded as the sun set. It was like someone had pressed a mute button on nature. Even the wind stopped. I told myself it was nothing, but my body disagreed. My skin prickled. My stomach twisted. I felt like something was watching us, something just beyond the tree line. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made my heart pound. The crack of a branch, the shuffle of leaves. I told myself it was just animals. But the footsteps, those weren't animals. I wasn't sure if I imagined it or not, but I swore I heard slow, deliberate footsteps circling our tent. Not running, not stumbling. Walking. Like whoever or whatever it was wanted us to know it was there. I held my breath, listening. Ben was out cold, snoring. I thought about waking him, but what would I even say? "Hey, I think there's someone out there, but I'm too scared to check?" He'd laugh, call me paranoid. So I stayed quiet. Eventually, the footsteps faded. I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe I was just on edge. The woods were unfamiliar. My brain was playing tricks on me, but the next morning I saw the footprints. They weren't ours. They were fresh, deep, leading around the tent in a perfect circle. My stomach dropped. Someone had been out there, watching us. I shook Ben awake, pointed at the prints. He frowned but didn't seem as freaked out as I was. "Could be a hiker," he said, "or an animal." I wanted to believe that, but the prints were human, barefoot. The toes dug into the dirt like whoever made them had been moving slowly, carefully. I told Ben we should leave. He laughed it off, said we were fine. "We came out here to get away, remember?" he said. "You're just not used to it." I wanted to argue, but I didn't. Instead, I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every little noise. The feeling of being watched never left. That night, it got worse. I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not Ben's. Something else. It was deep, slow, coming from outside the tent. My chest tightened. I could hear it shifting, moving. Then, the zipper. It started to lower. I froze. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something. But I couldn't. I just stared as the zipper moved inch by inch, something or someone on the other side. Then silence. Nothing moved. The zipper stopped halfway. I held my breath, waiting. The seconds stretched into eternity. Then, suddenly, a sharp, guttural noise. Like a growl, but not an animal's. It came from just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. I lunged for my flashlight, flicked it on. The light hit the zipper. Nothing there. No movement. No shadows. But the prints, they were back. I grabbed Ben, shaking him awake. This time, he didn't laugh. He saw the fear in my face, heard the tremble in my voice. We packed up in record time. No words, no discussion. We just grabbed our stuff and ran for the truck. As we drove away, I looked back, just for a second, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, tall, thin, barely visible in the darkness. Watching. I never went camping again. I used to love camping alone. Something about the silence, the way the air smells like pine and damp earth, the feeling of being completely cut off from the noise of everyday life. It always gave me a sense of peace. I never thought that would change, but it did. It changed one October when I went into the woods and saw something I shouldn't have. I had planned the trip for weeks. The spot I chose was about 15 miles off a back road, deep in the national forest. No campgrounds, no designated trails, just raw wilderness. I parked my truck near a clearing, packed my gear, and hiked a few miles in, following an old logging road that had been reclaimed by nature. I didn't see a single person on the way in, which was exactly how I wanted it. By the time I reached a good spot to set up camp, the sun was hanging low in the sky. I picked a small clearing next to a creek. The water was clear and fast-moving, perfect for drinking after filtering it. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. The air was crisp but not too cold. It was perfect. That first night was uneventful. I ate some canned soup, sat by the fire for a while, and eventually crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the distant hoots of an owl and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful, but the next day things started to feel off. I woke up early, made some instant coffee, and decided to do a bit of exploring. I had my map and compass, but mostly I just wanted to wander. The forest was dense, but not difficult to navigate. I walked for about an hour, following the creek upstream. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, near the bank of the creek, something was hanging from a tree. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe caught in some kind of snare. But as I got closer, I realized it was a bundle of sticks, tied together with what looked like old rope. The sticks were arranged in a weird, almost human shape. Something about it made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was nothing, just some hunter messing around, maybe kids playing a prank. But it didn't sit right with me. The rope looked old, like it had been there for a long time, but the sticks were fresh. Someone had made this recently. I turned around and headed back to camp, shaking off the unease. But as the day went on, that feeling didn't go away. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made my skin crawl. I wasn't scared exactly, but I wasn't comfortable either. That night, I made my fire a little bigger than usual. I sat close to it, listening. The forest around me felt different, too quiet. Even the usual sounds of the night, crickets, distant owls, were absent. The only noise was the crackling of my fire and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. A branch snapping, leaves crunching, footsteps, always just outside the light of the fire. I told myself it was animals, deer maybe, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The next morning I made a decision. I wasn't going to spend another night out there. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, constantly glancing around. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there, just beyond my sight. I started hiking back toward my truck, moving fast, too fast. About 2 miles in, I twisted my ankle on a hidden root. Pain shot up my leg, and I stumbled to the ground, cursing. I tried to stand, but putting weight on it was agony. I was still miles from my truck. I forced myself to keep moving, slower now, using a stick for support. Every step was a sharp burst of pain, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of those woods. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones in the soft dirt of the trail. They weren't mine. They were bigger, barefoot, and they were following the exact same path I had taken the day before. Someone had been tracking me. My stomach dropped. My hands started shaking. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been watching me since yesterday. Maybe longer. I didn't run, I couldn't, but I moved as fast as my ankle would allow. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. Every noise made my heart hammer. I was sure that at any moment, I'd hear footsteps rushing up behind me. But I didn't. I made it back to my truck, gasping for breath, my clothes soaked in sweat. I threw my gear in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I didn't relax until I was back on the main road, surrounded by other cars, civilization, safety. I never went back to that forest. I still go camping, but never alone, and never that deep into the woods, because I don't know who or what was out there with me, and I don't ever want to find out. I don't know if I'll ever go camping again. I used to love it, the peace, the solitude, the feeling of being out in the wild with nothing but the sounds of nature around me. It always felt like an escape from the routine of life. But after what happened last summer, I don't think I'll ever set foot in the woods again. I had planned a solo trip to a remote spot in the mountains. I wanted to challenge myself to disconnect from the world for a few days. I picked a location I had read about online, deep in the forest, miles away from any marked trails. It was supposed to be a place where few people ever went. That was part of the appeal. The drive to the trailhead was long and bumpy, the kind of road where you don't see another car for miles. By the time I parked and got my gear out, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. I set off quickly, following an old, overgrown trail that led deeper into the woods. The hike was tough, steep in places with loose rocks and thick undergrowth. I hadn't seen any signs of people the whole way in, which reassured me that I would have the place to myself. It took me a couple of hours to reach the spot I had chosen, a small clearing next to a creek. The water was crystal clear, the air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and cooked a quick meal before settling in for the night. That first night was peaceful. The only sounds were the occasional rustling in the underbrush and the distant hoot of an owl. I slept better than I had in months. The second day I spent exploring the area. I hiked up a nearby ridge to get a better view of the valley below. It was stunning, endless green stretching out in every direction. As I made my way back down, I noticed something strange. About half a mile from my campsite, There was a small pile of stones stacked neatly in a clearing. It wasn't natural. Someone had placed them there, put me on edge. I hadn't seen any signs of other campers. No footprints, no old fire pits, nothing. But someone had been here recently. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just an old marker left behind by another hiker. That night, as I was sitting by the fire, I started to feel uneasy. The woods felt different, quieter. The normal sounds of the forest seemed muted. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard something. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees behind me. I froze. My first thought was that it was an animal, but these weren't the sounds of a four-legged creature. They were human. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. I convinced myself it had been my imagination, that the forest was playing tricks on me. But I didn't sleep well that night. Every little noise made me jolt awake. I kept my knife close, just in case. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Around my campsite in the dirt were footprints. They weren't mine. Someone had been circling my tent while I slept. I packed up immediately. I told myself I was overreacting, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out. I should have listened. I started the hike back toward my car, moving as quickly as I could without exhausting myself. The entire time I felt watched. Every so often I would stop and listen. I heard nothing, but the feeling wouldn't go away. About an hour into the hike, I came across something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A fresh pile of stones, identical to the one I had seen the day before. And next to it, stuck into the ground, was a stick with something tied to it. Piece of fabric. My fabric. It was a torn strip from the shirt I had been wearing the day before. I didn't think. I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. My pack bounced against my back. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran before I finally reached my car. I threw my pack in, started the engine, and sped out of there, not daring to slow down until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I have said? That someone had been watching me? Stalking me? Leaving signs in the woods? There was no proof. No crime had been committed. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. I always thought of myself as someone who could handle being alone in the woods. I grew up camping, hiking, and spending time in nature without ever feeling afraid. I liked the quiet, the space to think, and the way the trees made me feel small in a way that was comforting. But last summer, I learned that the woods are different when you're truly alone, and that fear isn't something you choose. It's something that finds you. I had planned a solo camping trip deep in the mountains of northern Montana, a place I had visited a couple of times before with friends. This time, I wanted to challenge myself to go further in, beyond where most people would hike, and spend a few days in complete isolation. I packed my gear carefully. A tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for 5 days, a satellite phone in case of emergency, a knife, and a rifle for any potential wildlife encounters. I knew the risks. Bears, cougars, maybe a bad fall, but I felt prepared. I had done this before, just never alone. The first day was perfect. I hiked about 10 miles from where I parked my truck, following a narrow, overgrown trail that eventually disappeared entirely. That's what I wanted. No signs of people, no reminders of civilization. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of the forest. I set up camp near a small stream, cooked some dehydrated food over my portable stove, and watched the sun go down through the branches. The second day was uneventful, but by the third night, something changed. It started with a sound. I was lying in my tent, half asleep, when I heard what I thought was the snap of a branch. I opened my eyes, fully awake now, and listened. The woods are full of noises at night. Wind through the trees, small animals moving through the underbrush. But this was different. It had a weight to it, like something big was moving out there. I told myself it was an elk or a deer, maybe even a bear. But when I reached for my rifle, just to be safe, I realized my hand was shaking. I stayed still, listening. The sound came again, another snap, closer this time. Then silence. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just a dead, heavy stillness. I don't know how long I lay there, gripping my rifle, barely breathing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the early morning light filtering through the tent. Everything seemed normal again. I forced myself to laugh at how paranoid I had been. The woods had played tricks on me, that was all. I decided to stay one more night. That was a mistake. That evening, as the sun was setting, I went to gather some more firewood. I walked about 50 yards from camp, picking up dry branches, when I noticed something odd. The forest floor, which had been covered in leaves and pine needles, looked disturbed, like something had been dragged through it. I followed the marks, my pulse quickening. They led to a tree. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then I noticed deep, jagged scratches in the bark, far too large to be from any animal I knew. And there was something else. High up, almost at my eye level, was a long strip of fabric caught in the bark. It was faded, almost blending in with the tree, but when I touched it, I realized it was clothing. Old clothing, weathered and torn. My mind started racing. Was it from a lost hiker? An old campsite? Or was it something worse? I backed away, suddenly feeling exposed. The sun was almost gone, and the forest around me felt darker than it should have been. I hurried back to camp, throwing the wood down next to the fire pit. I wanted to leave, but hiking out in the dark wasn't an option. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made my heart pound. Every rustle in the leaves sent adrenaline coursing through me. Then, at some point in the night, I heard something that made my blood go cold. It was breathing, not the soft exhale of a deer or the snuffling of a bear. It was slow, deliberate, human. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just gripped my rifle and listened. The sound was right outside my tent, barely feet away. I could hear it shifting, as if it was crouched close to the ground. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. Eventually, I worked up the courage to reach for my flashlight. My fingers fumbled with the switch, and when the beam finally cut through the darkness, there was nothing there. But my gear had been moved. My backpack, which I had left zipped and tucked under the rain flap of my tent, was now half open, sitting 2 feet away. Some of my food was missing. My knife, which had been inside the backpack, was now lying in the dirt. Something had been in my camp. I didn't wait until morning. I packed up as fast as I could, heart hammering in my chest. The hike back to my truck was the longest hike of my life. Every step I felt watched. Every shadow between the trees felt like it was hiding something. I didn't stop to eat, to rest, to think. I just walked, pushing myself forward. When I finally reached my truck, I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't look back. I don't know what was out there. Person, predator, something worse. All I know is that I'll never camp alone again. I never should have gone camping alone. I knew it the second I heard that first noise in the woods. I had planned this trip for months. Work had been killing me, and I needed a break from everything. The emails, the meetings, the constant noise. I figured a weekend in the mountains would help. Just me, my tent, and the quiet. I chose a spot deep in the woods, far from the usual campsites, somewhere no one would bother me. That was the whole point. The first day went fine. I hiked a few miles, set up camp by a small stream, and gathered enough firewood to last the night. Felt good being out there alone, away from people. As the sun went down, the air cooled fast, and the sounds of the forest changed. The rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds. It was peaceful. I cooked a quick meal over the fire, sat back against a log, and just listened to the night. Then I heard it. First, it was just a snap, a single branch breaking somewhere behind my tent. I figured it was an animal, probably a deer. But then, a few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time. Another snap, followed by the crunch of leaves. Something was moving out there, circling my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it into the trees. Nothing, just darkness and the endless stretch of woods. The fire crackled beside me, the only sound breaking the silence. I told myself it was nothing, maybe the wind, maybe a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to ignore it. I doused the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped it shut. Lying there, I listened. Every small noise made my heart race. After what felt like hours, exhaustion won. I drifted off to sleep. A noise woke me up. Something outside. Heavy footsteps. Not the light scurrying of an animal, something bigger. Slow, deliberate. My body went rigid. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing. Low, steady breathing. I reached for my knife. My fingers wrapped around the handle, but I didn't move. I just lay there, waiting, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound was gone. No footsteps, no breathing, just silence. I barely slept the rest of the night. Morning came and I forced myself out of the tent. The first thing I noticed were the footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, big, deep prints in the dirt, circling my campsite. My stomach turned. I wasn't alone out here. I packed up fast. I didn't want to spend another night in that spot. I'd hike back toward the main trail, find somewhere else to camp. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Every rustle, every shadow felt wrong. I was being watched. I knew it. By midday, I reached a clearing. I stopped to rest, but something caught my eye. Another set of footprints, fresh ones, leading into the trees. And then I saw something worse. A piece of fabric, hanging from a low branch. It was from my tent, torn, dangling like a warning. My stomach clenched. Someone had been in my camp while I slept. Someone had taken this and left it here on purpose. I needed to get out. Now, I pushed forward, moving fast. I wasn't thinking about where I was going, just that I needed to be somewhere safer, somewhere with other people. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I kept going. Then I saw it, a cabin, small, run down, half hidden in the trees. I didn't care who it belonged to. I needed help. I ran up to the door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Silence. I tried the handle, it was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was dusty, abandoned looking. A single chair, a table, an old wood stove. But something felt off. It smelled wrong, like old sweat and something rotting. Then I saw the pictures. Pinned to the wall, a collection of photos. My campsite, my tent, me, all taken from a distance. My blood turned to ice. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Whoever had been watching me, following me, they had been here. They knew I'd find this place. I turned to run, but I wasn't fast enough. The door slammed shut behind me. A heavy footstep creaked against the wooden floor. Someone was in here with me. I ran for the window, crashing through the glass, hitting the ground hard outside. Pain shot through my hands and knees, but I scrambled to my feet, running, tearing through the trees. I could hear footsteps behind me, gaining. Then a voice, not words, just a sound, low, guttural, like a growl. Close, too close. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did. I don't remember how long I ran, only that when I finally stopped, I was back near the main trail. The sun had started to set, but I didn't stop moving until I saw another person. A hiker. I practically collapsed in front of him, gasping out something about needing help. By the time we reached a ranger station, I was shaking so hard I couldn't speak. They sent a team back to my campsite, to the cabin. They found my tent, my gear, but not the photos, and not the person who had been watching me. I never went camping alone again. I always thought camping alone was a peaceful escape. I liked the silence, the fresh air, the feeling of being out in the middle of nowhere where no one could bother me. That's why I took these trips every few months, to get away from everything. But this time, something was different. Something was wrong. I had picked a spot deep in the woods, about 10 miles off the nearest road. It was a place I had camped before, far from any trails, perfect for solitude. I hiked in early, set up my tent, and started a fire before sunset. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your skin but makes the fire feel even better. I sat there for a while, eating, listening to the distant sounds of the woods, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, normal sounds. Then, as night settled in, I noticed something strange. The forest had gone quiet, too quiet. It wasn't a peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that felt wrong, like something was off. Usually I could hear crickets, maybe an owl, but now there was nothing, just silence. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But I felt it. Something was watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it around the trees, scanning the darkness. Nothing. The fire crackled behind me, the only sound in the dead still night. I shook it off and went into my tent. I zipped up the entrance, got into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. I must have dozed off, but I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it. A sound outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My body tensed up. I held my breath, listening. The steps weren't heavy like a bear's. They were softer, careful, human. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight in my hand. My mind raced. Who would be out here this deep in the woods? I knew there were no other campsites nearby. No one should have been anywhere near me. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing. Slow, steady. I stayed completely still. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just listened. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps started again. They moved away, slow, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, knife in hand, waiting for the first light of morning. As soon as the sun started to rise, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The ground was covered in fresh tracks, barefoot prints, not animal, human. They circled my campsite, stopping at my tent before moving away into the woods. I packed my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't take my time. I just wanted to get out. My heart pounded in my chest the entire hike back. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching me, following me, but I didn't. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. I tossed my gear in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I sat there for a second, catching my breath, my hands still shaking. Then I noticed something. On the driver's side window, in the dirt and dust that had collected on the glass, was a single handprint. A bare handprint, bigger than mine. I hadn't seen it when I arrived. I hadn't left it there. Someone had been here, watching, waiting. I never camped alone again. I don't know why I went out there alone. Maybe it was the stress, the need to disconnect, or just the thought that I needed to prove to myself that I could handle it. I had camped before, plenty of times, but never alone. There was always someone around, a friend, a cousin, a group from work. This time, I wanted to be by myself. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wilderness. I picked a remote area, far from the usual campgrounds. A place where I wouldn't hear the distant sound of cars or see the glow of someone else's fire through the trees. I drove for hours, deep into the national forest, until I found a narrow dirt road that looked barely used. My truck bounced along the uneven path, the trees thick on either side, branches scraping the sides like fingers dragging across metal. When I finally reached a clearing, I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening. The silence was heavy, almost too heavy. No birds, no wind, just the faint ringing in my ears from the long drive. I shook it off and got to work. I set up my tent near the tree lean, built a small fire pit, and stacked my supplies carefully. I brought more than enough food, water, and firewood. I wasn't taking any chances. By the time the sun started setting, the fire was crackling, and I was settled in. The first night wasn't bad. It was cold, sure, and every little noise outside the tent made me freeze, but that was expected. I listened to the rustling leaves, the distant snap of a branch, the occasional hoot of an owl. Normal forest sounds, nothing alarming. I barely slept, though. Every time I drifted off, I'd jolt awake, convinced I heard something close. But when I'd peek out of the tent, there was nothing, just darkness and the dim glow of the dying fire. The second day was fine. I hiked a little, collected some more wood, and even found a small stream where I refilled my water bottle. But the feeling had started, that creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Being out there alone, so far from anything, does that to you. Your brain starts inventing threats, turning every shadow into something watching you. I tried to shake it, but it stuck to me like a bad smell. That night, it got worse. I was sitting by the fire, eating a can of chili, when I heard something. Not the usual creak of the woods, but something deliberate. A footstep. Not a deer, not some small animal. This was heavier. I turned my head so fast my neck popped, but I didn't see anything. Just darkness beyond the fire's glow. My hand went to the hatchet resting next to me, but I didn't grab it. Not yet. I listened. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination. I forced myself to relax, finish eating, and clean up. I made sure all my food was sealed and stored properly away from the tent. Then I crawled inside, zipped up the entrance, and settled in. I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the tent. Not an animal, not the wind, something moving, slow, deliberate, close. I held my breath. The fire was out by now, so the only light came from the moon, casting pale shapes through the fabric of the tent. I could see a shadow, a figure standing just outside. Not moving, just standing there. My body locked up. Every instinct screamed at me to do something, to make a noise, to grab the hatchet. But I couldn't move. I just lay there, my heart slamming against my ribs. Then, just as silently as it appeared, the shadow moved away. Slow, steady footsteps, fading into the trees. I stayed awake until the first hint of dawn. Then I forced myself out of the tent, gripping the hatchet so hard my knuckles ached. I searched the area, but there were no tracks. Nothing to prove someone had been there. But I knew what I saw. I should have left. I should have packed up right then and there. But I didn't. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, that I had imagined it in that half-asleep state. I told myself no one was out there. That night I was wrong. Started the same. A noise, footsteps, but this time they didn't stop. They circled my tent. Slow, methodical. I gripped the hatchet and forced myself to breathe as quietly as possible. Then, the worst sound I've ever heard. The zipper of my tent, moving. Not fast, not yanked open, just a slow, careful pull. I exploded out of my sleeping bag, screaming as I swung the hatchet blindly. The sound of something, scrambling away, the crash of footsteps vanishing into the woods. My fire was nothing but embers, barely lighting the clearing, but I saw the edge of movement, a figure just before it disappeared. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and whatever I could carry in one hand, and I ran to my truck. I didn't pack up my tent, didn't care about the rest of my gear. I just got in, locked the doors, and turned on the headlights. Nothing. I sat there, shaking, waiting for something to come rushing out of the woods. But nothing did. I don't remember the drive back, just that I didn't stop, didn't slow down until I saw the first signs of civilization. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, my hands aching from how tightly I had been holding on. I never went back for my gear. I don't know who or what was out there with me. I don't want to know. I always wanted to go on a solo camping trip. Just me and the woods. No distractions, no noise, just the sound of the trees swaying in the wind and the occasional rustling of wildlife. Sounded peaceful. Sounded perfect. So, I picked a weekend, packed my gear, and drove out to a remote section of the forest that wasn't as popular as the designated campgrounds. I wanted solitude. No people, no light pollution, no civilization. Just raw nature. The drive itself was long, nearly 4 hours on the highway, then another hour on a winding dirt road leading deep into the forest. The last 20 minutes of driving were rough. The road narrowed, flanked by thick trees on both sides, and I had to slow down to avoid hitting potholes and exposed roots. Finally, I reached a clearing, a small open patch surrounded by towering pines. It was perfect. The forest was dense, making it impossible to see more than a few feet into the trees, but I liked that. It gave the place a secluded feeling. I parked, got out, and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, fresh, and filled with the earthy scent of damp soil and pine needles. There were no sounds except for birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the trees for shade but far enough away to avoid any falling branches. I gathered some firewood, built a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun began to set, I sat back in my chair, sipping on a warm drink, watching the flames dance. It was everything I had hoped for: quiet, peaceful, and completely isolated. But then, as the last light faded from the sky, something changed. First, it was small things. The woods grew too silent, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. The wind had died down, and even the insects had stopped chirping. I felt it before I noticed it, a strange heaviness in the air, like something unseen was pressing against me. I shook it off, probably just my mind playing tricks on me. I added more wood to the fire, watching the flames roar back to life, pushing back the darkness. But then I heard it, a sound from the trees, a single snap, a branch breaking. It wasn't an animal. I knew that much. Animals move through the undergrowth, making rustling sounds. This was deliberate. A single, sharp snap, like someone stepping on a twig. I turned, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight, but I couldn't see anything. My flashlight was inside my tent. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to take my eyes off the trees. Then another sound, closer this time, a low, almost imperceptible shift in the foliage, like something was brushing against the leaves. I forced myself to stand, moving slowly, trying not to make a sound. I reached into my tent and grabbed the flashlight. My hands felt clumsy, stiff, but I managed to switch it on and aim the beam into the woods. Nothing, just trees, motionless and silent. I exhaled, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat back down, closer to the fire this time, and kept the flashlight in my lap. I wasn't scared, I told myself, just being cautious. The night dragged on. Every so often, I would hear something. A faint rustling, a distant crack, but nothing ever revealed itself. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I crawled into my tent. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise jolted me awake. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like something was just outside, watching. When the sun finally rose, I was relieved. I stepped out of the tent, stretching, shaking off the stiffness. The woods looked different in the daylight, less menacing, more alive. I told myself I had let my imagination get the best of me. I spent the day exploring, hiking through the forest, gathering more firewood. By the time evening came, I felt more at ease. But then night fell again, and the feeling returned. The unnatural silence, the pressure in the air, the sense of being watched. I kept my flashlight close, my knife closer. The fire burned bright, but I couldn't relax. Every time I turned my head, I expected to see something lurking in the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. Then the sound. Not a twig breaking this time, not a rustling. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees. I froze, gripping my flashlight, my pulse hammering in my ears. I aimed the beam into the woods. Nothing. Then I saw it. Not a person, not an animal, but something that shouldn't have been there. A shape, barely visible in the darkness, crouched low to the ground. Watching me, I stood, my breath caught in my throat. The thing didn't move. It just stayed there, hunched and silent, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I didn't wait. I grabbed my knife, my keys, and backed toward my car, keeping my flashlight trained on the figure. My gear, my tent, I left it all behind. I jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine roared to life. I looked up. The figure was gone. I didn't stick around. I threw the car into reverse, spun it around, and sped down the dirt road, my tires kicking up dust. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it wasn't. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. I always loved camping. There was something about being out in the woods, away from everything, that felt freeing. The silence, the fresh air, the way the stars looked when there weren't city lights drowning them out. It was all perfect. I had gone on solo trips before, but this time I picked a remote spot, deep in the forest, somewhere nobody would bother me. I had done my research. I scoured maps, read up on the area, and picked a location far from the usual camping grounds. It wasn't even an official campsite, just a clearing I found on an old hiking forum, a place only experienced campers went. It was about a 3-hour hike from the nearest road, and I liked the idea of being completely alone. No noisy campers, no litter, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. I set out early in the morning, my pack loaded with everything I needed: tent, food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a knife, a small hatchet, and a few other essentials. I followed the trail for the first couple of hours, then veered off onto a smaller path that led deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, the air cooler. I could hear nothing but birds and the occasional rustling of leaves as small animals darted away. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to set. It was the perfect spot, flat ground, surrounded by tall trees, with a small stream nearby for water. I set up my tent quickly, gathered some wood for a fire, and got everything ready for the night. As darkness fell, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal and enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the flames and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, but as the night went on, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, like I was being watched. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. I was alone, deep in the woods, and my brain was just adjusting to the isolation. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I stayed up longer than I planned, staring into the fire, listening. The sounds of the forest were normal. Crickets, rustling leaves, distant animal calls. Nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling remained. I finally forced myself to get some sleep, crawling into my tent and zipping it up tight. I kept my knife close, just in case. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It was dead silent. If you've ever been in the woods, you know how rare that is. The forest is always making noise. Wind through the trees, insects, distant animals. But now there was nothing, not even a breeze, just complete, unnatural silence. My skin prickled. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves. It wasn't far from my tent. Slow, deliberate steps, not an animal. Animals move erratically, scurrying or darting. This was different. It was careful, purposeful. I stayed completely still. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? No, bears wouldn't move like that. Another camper? No one else should be out here. A ranger? No reason for one to be this deep in the woods at night. The steps stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath. Then the sound of fabric shifting. Someone or something was touching my tent. I clenched my knife, every muscle tensed. The pressure of a hand against the fabric, moving slowly, like it was feeling for something, testing. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to do something, but I stayed frozen. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The hand withdrew. The silence stretched on. Minutes passed, maybe longer. My ears strained for any sound, but there was nothing. I don't know how long I lay there before exhaustion finally took over. When I woke up, the sun was rising, casting long shadows through the trees. I sat up, my body stiff, my mind still foggy with fear. Slowly, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The first thing I noticed was the footprints. They were human, barefoot. Whoever or whatever it was had walked around my tent, pausing at the entrance. The prints were clear in the dirt, leading away into the woods. I followed them for a few feet before stopping. They didn't trail off. They just ended, like whoever made them had vanished. I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't bother eating. I didn't bother checking for more signs. I just wanted out. The hike back felt longer than before, every snap of a twig sending my heart into overdrive. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone following me, but I never did. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and sped off without looking back. I still don't know what happened that night. I tell myself it was just some weirdo messing with me, maybe a hermit living in the woods. But deep down, I know it was something else, something I can't explain. And I know one thing for sure: I'll never go camping alone again. I always loved the idea of camping. Something about being deep in the woods, away from everything, was peaceful. It was supposed to be an escape from the noise, from the constant hum of the city. Just me, the trees, and silence. That's what I thought, at least. I had planned this trip for weeks. I found a remote spot online, a place not many people knew about. It was deep in the Appalachian wilderness, miles away from the nearest town. There were no campgrounds, no paved trails, no cell service. Just nature. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, flashlight, knife, extra batteries. I even brought a small hatchet for firewood. I was prepared, or so I thought. The drive took almost 6 hours. The last part was nothing but a dirt road, winding through thick woods. My tires kicked up dust, and the trees swallowed the sunlight. It felt like I was driving into another world. I finally reached the spot I had picked out, a small clearing near a slow-moving stream. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and took a moment to appreciate the silence. There was no traffic, no voices, just the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. I took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill my lungs. The first few hours were peaceful. I made a small fire, cooked some food, and sat back, listening to the sounds of the forest. The sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The air grew colder, and the sounds of birds were replaced by the distant calls of owls. Then I heard something. It was faint at first, a soft rustling in the brush. I assumed it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I wasn't worried. But then it happened again, closer this time. I shone my flashlight toward the noise, but the light barely cut through the thick darkness. I couldn't see anything. The rustling stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Animals move at night. It was normal. I went back to my fire, trying to push the sound out of my mind. But then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just rustling. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, not the random movements of an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the area. Again, nothing. My heart was pounding now. I stood there, listening. The footsteps had stopped. The woods were silent. I tried to shake it off. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just paranoia. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and laid down. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound made my eyes snap open. The wind through the trees, the creak of a branch, the distant hoot of an owl. I forced myself to close my eyes. Then, around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, but then I realized the woods were silent. Too silent. No wind, no insects, no night sounds. Just silence. I held my breath, listening. And then, right outside my tent, I heard breathing. Slow, steady breathing. Not an animal. Not a bear or a coyote. It was human. I stayed completely still. My mind was racing. Who was out here? I was miles from any town, deep in the woods. No one should be here. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The breathing continued, slow and steady, just outside the thin layer of nylon separating me from whoever, or whatever, was out there. Then the breathing stopped. I didn't move. I waited, listening. Minutes passed. Nothing. I slowly unzipped the tent just an inch, just enough to peek out. The fire had died down, casting faint embers. My flashlight was still outside, sitting on a rock. And then I saw them, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees, motionless, watching. My heart nearly stopped. They were too far away to make out any details, just a dark shape against the trees. But they were there, staring. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, slowly, they stepped back into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. I waited for what felt like hours, knife in hand, eyes locked on the tree line. Nothing. Finally, as dawn started to break, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about leaving a mess. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I threw everything into my car and drove, not looking back. Even now, I don't know who or what I saw that night. I don't know why they were there or what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I'll never go camping alone again. I never liked camping, but my friend Jake convinced me to go. He had this whole plan, 3 days in a remote part of the forest, just us, a tent, and a few supplies. He called it disconnecting. But to me, it just sounded like an opportunity to be miserable in the cold, away from my bed. I agreed anyway. Maybe part of me wanted to prove I wasn't as much of a homebody as everyone thought. We drove for hours into the mountains, the road turning from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. By the time we reached the spot Jake had marked on his map, the sun was already dipping low. It was one of those places no one but experienced hikers or hunters would bother going to. Dense trees, no cell signal, and not a single sign of civilization. I didn't like it, but Jake was thrilled. He parked the truck, and we started unloading. The air was cold, and the forest was silent in a way that made me uneasy. No wind, no birds, just the occasional creak of branches shifting overhead. We set up camp by a small clearing near a narrow, slow-moving creek. The tent was large enough for both of us, but I already knew I wouldn't be sleeping well. That first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked some canned food, and sat in silence. Jake tried making small talk, but my nerves made it hard to focus. I kept looking around, scanning the trees. Felt like something was off, but I couldn't place it. At some point, we called it a night. I crawled into my sleeping bag and shut my eyes. Sleep didn't come easy. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside made my mind race. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons, maybe a deer. Still, it took hours before I finally drifted off. I woke up suddenly, unsure why. The fire had died down, leaving only a faint glow of embers. It was so dark I couldn't see past the tent walls. I listened. Nothing. Just silence. But then, faintly, I heard it. A soft crunch outside. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The steps moved around the tent, circling us. Not heavy enough to be a bear, but too controlled to be an animal. My mind raced. Jake was still sleeping, his slow breathing steady beside me. I wanted to wake him, but I was frozen. The steps stopped, right outside, inches from where I lay. Then nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, every muscle tense, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep without realizing it. The next morning, I told Jake. He laughed it off. "Probably a deer," he said, brushing it away like it was nothing. I wasn't so sure. The prints around our tent weren't hoof marks. They were footprints, barefoot, human. We should have left right then. Every instinct told me to pack up and go. But Jake insisted it was nothing. "Some hiker passing through," he said. "It's not a big deal." I tried to shake it off, but the feeling never left me. That afternoon, we went deeper into the woods, following a trail Jake had found on an old map. It was barely a trail, overgrown, uneven. As we walked, I kept feeling like we were being watched. Every time I turned around, there was nothing, just trees, just silence. At one point, we found something, an old campsite, but it wasn't abandoned in the normal way. The tent was still standing, zipped shut, but collapsed inward, like something heavy had been on top of it. A backpack lay beside the fire pit, half unzipped, its contents scattered. Clothes, a flashlight with dead batteries, a water bottle still half full. It looked recent, too recent. The fire pit was cold, but there was no mold on the food wrappers. Whoever had been here hadn't been gone long. Jake shrugged. Maybe they left in a hurry. But why? I asked. He didn't answer. We kept walking. The deeper we went, the worse I felt. Something was wrong with this place. The trees were too thick, the air too still. Eventually, I convinced Jake to turn back. By the time we got to our campsite, the sun was already setting. I was on edge. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my skin crawl, but nothing happened. No footsteps, no noises, just silence. The third day, we decided to pack up early. I was relieved. I wanted to get out of there. As we packed, Jake stopped suddenly, staring at the ground. "Did you do this?" he asked. I looked down. My stomach dropped. All around our tent, deep in the dirt, were handprints. Dozens of them, some small, some larger, pressed into the earth like whoever made them had been crawling. They led from the trees, circling our tent, then disappeared back into the woods. Neither of us spoke. We just finished packing as fast as we could. The drive back was quiet. Neither of us wanted to talk about what we saw, but I knew Jake was just as shaken as I was. We never went camping again, never spoke about it. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about those footsteps, those handprints, and I wonder if whatever was out there is still waiting. I never planned on writing this down, but some things feel heavier when left inside your head. Maybe if I put it into words, I can finally stop seeing those trees in my sleep. Maybe I can stop hearing the crunch of footsteps behind me when I'm alone. It started as a simple camping trip, one night in the woods just to clear my mind. I'd been feeling suffocated by the same routine every day, the same walls, the same dull hum of life grinding me down. So I packed a tent, some food, a flashlight, and a hunting knife just in case. The plan was to drive out to a remote part of the national forest, hike a few miles in, set up camp, and spend the night under the stars. The drive was uneventful, just me and the long stretches of empty road. The air smelled like damp earth when I stepped out of the car, the kind of fresh scent that made you feel far away from everything. I parked near a small gravel pull-off, grabbed my gear, and started down the trail. The hike in was peaceful. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long golden streaks over the dirt path. It was quiet. The only sounds were my boots crunching over leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Felt good to be out there, alone with nothing but the woods. No cars, no voices, no distractions. I walked for about an hour before I found a clearing near a small stream. It was perfect. The ground was flat. The trees formed a natural barrier against the wind, and the water was close enough for convenience but far enough that it wouldn't keep me up all night. Setting up camp was routine. I pitched the tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered some firewood. By the time the sun started dipping below the treetops, I had a decent fire going. I ate a simple meal, just some jerky and nuts, while staring into the flames. The silence was comforting, wrapping around me like a blanket. As the night deepened, the woods came alive with sounds. The rustling of leaves, distant calls of animals, the occasional snap of a twig. I wasn't afraid, this was normal. I had been camping enough times to know the noises of the forest. But then there was something else, something that didn't belong. It was faint at first, a rhythmic sound, too distant to make out clearly. It came and went, weaving through the natural noises of the forest. I told myself it was probably just the wind, maybe a branch creaking under its own weight. I tried to ignore it, but as the hours passed, it became harder to dismiss. The sound wasn't random like the usual noises of the forest. It had a pattern, a deliberate, almost human rhythm. I stayed by the fire longer than I intended, not wanting to leave its warmth and light. Eventually, exhaustion won. I banked the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it shut. My knife was within arm's reach just in case. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of footsteps. Not an animal, not the wind. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just outside my tent. I lay there, heart pounding, listening as they circled my camp. I held my breath, ears straining for any hint of what it was. My fingers curled around the handle of my knife, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. Then silence. It was worse than the footsteps. For long minutes I heard nothing. No rustling, no movement, just the deafening weight of silence pressing in from all sides. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then something touched my tent. A slow, dragging motion, like fingers tracing along the fabric. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I stayed frozen. Whoever or whatever was out there was trying to see if I would react. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay still. The dragging stopped. Then the footsteps started again. This time they were moving away. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. My ears strained for any hint of movement. Eventually, when I was sure I couldn't hear anything, I reached for my flashlight. I clicked it on, flooding the tent with light. My hand shook as I unzipped the entrance just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The fire was just embers now, casting weak orange glows against the trees. The woods looked the same as before, but something felt different, like the air itself had thickened. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, waiting for the sun to rise. When it finally did, I stepped outside to check my surroundings. Everything seemed normal at first. My gear was untouched. No footprints in the dirt. No broken branches. Just the quiet hum of the forest waking up. But then I saw it. On a tree just a few feet from my tent were deep scratches. Long, deliberate marks carved into the bark. They weren't there the night before. Something had been out there, watching me, testing me. I packed up in record time, my gut telling me not to stay any longer. The whole hike back, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing in the trees, just out of reach. But there was nothing, just the woods, stretching endlessly in every direction. I reached my car and threw my gear inside without a second thought. When I turned the key, the engine hesitated for a second before roaring to life. I pulled out onto the road, my hands gripping the wheel too tight. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't know if it was a person, some local who didn't want me in their woods, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. I always thought I was the kind of person who could handle anything. I grew up hunting with my dad, fishing in remote lakes, spending days alone in the woods without a worry. But after what happened on that camping trip, I don't think I'll ever go out there alone again. It was late October, right at the tail end of the camping season. Most people had packed it up for the year, but I wanted one last trip before winter made the roads impassable. I drove out to a place I'd been before, deep in the forests of Montana, miles away from any town, far from where cell service reached. I liked the solitude. I liked the quiet. But looking back, I realized that maybe there's a reason people don't go out there alone. The spot I picked was near a river, a place I'd fished at a few times before. I parked my truck on the old dirt road, grabbed my gear, and hiked in about 3 miles. The air was crisp, the leaves dry beneath my boots. The trees were mostly bare, their skeletal branches reaching up at the dull gray sky. I liked the cold, kept the bugs away, made everything still. Setting up camp was routine. I pitched my tent, got a fire going, set out my cooking gear. The river was close enough that I could hear the steady rush of water and the occasional snap of a branch as some small animal darted through the underbrush. Nothing out of the ordinary. I made dinner, ate by the fire, and watched the sky go black. It was around midnight when I first noticed it. A sound just beyond the light of my fire. Not an animal, not the wind. A crunch, a deliberate step on dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. Could have been a deer, but I knew what deer sounded like, and this was different. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it through the trees. Nothing, just shadows and trunks and leaves shifting in the breeze. I told myself it was nothing. That's what you do when you're out there alone. If you start jumping at every little sound, you'll drive yourself crazy. I put more wood on the fire, sat back, and let the heat wash over me. But that feeling didn't go away. That crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. Eventually, I went to bed, rifle close at hand. I wasn't scared, not yet, just cautious, but I didn't sleep well. Every little noise outside had me opening my eyes, gripping my gun. The wind through the trees, the rustling of leaves, and once or twice that same deliberate crunch of footsteps. Morning came and I felt stupid, paranoid. I stepped out of my tent, stretched, let the cold morning air wake me up. I made coffee, ate a granola bar, and tried to shake off that uneasy feeling from the night before. But then I saw them, footprints, not mine, fresh, pressed into the soft earth near my campsite. They came from the woods, stopped a few feet from my tent, then turned around and went back the way they came. I just stood there, staring at them, my brain trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe I made them last night and just didn't remember, but they weren't my boots. The tread was different, the size was different, and I would have noticed them before going to bed. I felt that same prickling sensation on my skin, that same crawling awareness that I wasn't alone. I turned and looked out into the trees, scanning for movement. Nothing. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I told myself to stay calm. People hike through here all the time. Maybe someone passed by, got curious about my campsite, and then left. It wasn't illegal to be here. It wasn't even that unusual. But still, they came right up to my tent. I forced myself to go about my day. I went down to the river, fished for a while, caught a couple of trout, enough for dinner. But even as I stood there with my line in the water, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd turn my head quickly, trying to catch whoever or whatever it was, but there was never anything there. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already dipping low. I cleaned my fish, got the fire going again, cooked my dinner. I kept my rifle next to me, loaded, safety off, just in case. The night came fast. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the cold air. I sat close to it, staring into the darkness beyond the trees, my ears straining for any sound. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Not footsteps exactly, but movement. The sound of someone, or something, shifting its weight, trying to stay quiet. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing, just that deep black between the trunks, the endless forest stretching beyond my sight. Then I saw it, a shape just barely visible between the trees. Human but wrong, too still, standing there watching. My stomach dropped, my grip tightened around my rifle. I aimed the flashlight directly at it, but as soon as the light touched it, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with my rifle in my lap, listening. The footsteps came and went, circling my camp, never coming too close. Whoever it was, they wanted me to know they were there. By dawn, I was done. I packed up fast, barely eating, barely thinking about anything except getting the hell out of there. My hands were shaking as I loaded my pack, doused the fire, grabbed my rifle. The hike back to my truck was the longest 3 miles of my life. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, feeling that presence just out of sight. The footprints followed me for the first mile, then disappeared. I made it back to my truck, threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and peeled out of there so fast I kicked up a cloud of dust behind me. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road, until I saw other cars, other people. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding. Only then did I let myself believe I was safe. I don't know who it was. A hermit, a hunter, some lunatic living out in the woods? I don't know, and I don't want to know. I never went back to that place. Never will. Some things you just don't mess with. And being alone in the woods, too far for anyone to hear you scream, that's one of them. I've always been a fan of solo camping. There's something about the silence, the isolation, the feeling of being completely disconnected from the world that appeals to me. I never thought much about the dangers that could come with it. I always figured that as long as I was careful, brought enough supplies, and stayed aware of my surroundings, I'd be fine. Last summer, I took a trip deep into a national forest I had never visited before. It wasn't an official campground, just a remote patch of land I had found through research. It was supposed to be untouched, free of people, free of noise, exactly what I was looking for. The drive took longer than expected. The dirt roads leading into the woods were rough, barely maintained, and lined with thick trees. My truck bounced over potholes, tires kicking up dust. I remember looking at the gas gauge and making a mental note to be mindful of how far I was from civilization. There was no cell service. I found a good spot near a small clearing. A river flowed nearby, and the tree cover provided enough shade to keep things cool. I spent the first few hours setting up my tent, gathering firewood, and making sure my gear was in order. I had my usual supplies: a hunting knife, bear spray, a flashlight, a small hatchet, and a .357 revolver. I never went camping without a firearm. You never know what you'll run into out there. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, listened to the sounds of the woods, and fell asleep without trouble. I woke up once in the middle of the night to the sound of twigs snapping, but I brushed it off as an animal and went back to sleep. The second day, I hiked around the area. I followed the river upstream, took some photos, and just enjoyed being alone. The woods were dense, but I had marked my path well enough to avoid getting lost. I didn't see any signs of people. No footprints, no trash, no old campsites. It felt like I was the only person who had ever been there. That night, things changed. I was sitting by the fire, finishing up a meal, when I heard something moving in the woods. It wasn't the usual rustling of a small animal. It was slow, deliberate. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. The fire crackled, filling the silence. I reached for my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness and branches swaying in the wind. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe an elk, but something about it felt off. I went to bed uneasy, keeping my revolver within arm's reach. At some point in the night, I woke up again. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining things. There were footsteps outside my tent. Slow, crunching steps. I held my breath, gripping the revolver. The steps stopped, then moved again, circling the tent. I was wide awake now, my heart pounding. I wanted to call out, but something in me told me to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped after a few minutes. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a light, restless sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The ground was disturbed, footprints, not animal tracks, boot prints. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. The nearest road was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single car or person since I arrived. Someone had been watching me, walking around my tent while I slept. I packed up quickly. I wasn't going to stick around to see who it was. As I loaded my gear into the truck, I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see someone standing there, watching. But there was nothing, just silence. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The truck rumbled to life, and I took one last look at the clearing before backing out. That's when I saw it. A small wooden carving, placed neatly on the log where I had been sitting the night before. A figure, human-like, but rough, crudely shaped. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just drove. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing: I'll never go camping alone again. I went camping alone, which was a mistake. I know that now. I had done it before multiple times and nothing had ever happened. I always liked the solitude. Something about being out there. Just me and the trees, the wind, the dirt. It was peaceful. Until it wasn't. I had picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from any designated camping area. I wanted isolation. The place I chose was near a small, slow-moving river, surrounded by dense woods. There was no one around for miles. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and made myself comfortable as the sun started setting. Everything felt normal. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some food over the fire, read a book by flashlight, and eventually crawled into my sleeping bag. The only noises were the occasional rustling in the bushes, raccoons or some other harmless animal. I slept well. The second day, I decided to explore deeper into the woods. I marked trees with my knife as I went, making sure I could find my way back. The deeper I walked, the quieter it got. No birds, no insects, just silence. Felt wrong. I turned back after a couple of miles, constantly checking over my shoulder. That night, as I sat by my fire, I had the feeling I wasn't alone. I kept hearing sounds, branches snapping, something moving just beyond the firelight. I shined my flashlight into the darkness but saw nothing. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I barely slept that night. Every little noise made me sit up, heart pounding. I held my knife in my hand, just in case. Nothing happened, but the feeling of being watched never left. The third day, I decided I had had enough. I started packing up my camp. As I was stuffing my sleeping bag into my pack, I noticed something strange. My knife was missing. I knew exactly where I had put it the night before, right next to me inside the tent. I tore through all my gear, looking for it. It was gone. Panic started creeping in. Someone had been in my camp. Someone had taken my knife. I needed to get out of there. I shouldered my pack and started hiking back to my car, following the GPS on my phone. I moved fast, trying to put as much distance between me and my campsite as possible. The feeling of being watched never went away. Every now and then, I swore I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, nothing was there. Then I saw it. A footprint. Not mine. Fresh. Deep. Someone had been following me. I started running. Branches whipped against my face. My breath came in short gasps. I wasn't thinking anymore, just moving. I didn't care if I lost the trail. I just needed to get away. Then I saw something up ahead. My heart dropped. It was my campsite. I had been running in circles. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood there, panting, looking at my extinguished fire, my scattered gear. I didn't understand how it had happened. I had been following the GPS. There was no way I had turned back, unless someone had led me there. I fought against the panic, trying to think. I couldn't stay. I had to get out. This time, I forced myself to slow down, to think clearly. I took out my phone again and carefully followed the GPS, double-checking my direction. As I walked, I kept glancing behind me. I knew someone was there. I couldn't see them, but I knew. My skin crawled with the certainty of it. After what felt like hours, I finally saw my car in the distance. Relief washed over me, but I didn't slow down. I sprinted the last stretch, threw my pack into the trunk, and jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A figure, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove straight home, my mind racing the entire way. I haven't been camping since. I don't think I ever will again.